Hey, guys, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In a world where most snacks looked suspicious and tasted worse, apple fritters were a rare win. Sweet, hot, and slightly dangerous, just like every good medieval decision. These golden little pucks were the closest thing to a medieval donut, minus the frosting and food safety standards. So, what exactly went into a fritter back then? Apples, obviously, but not the shiny, polished supermarket kind. Think small, tart, knobbly things that grew behind the alehouse and may or may not have been stolen from a neighbor's tree. They were chopped up, tossed in a rough batter of flour, eggs, and sometimes ale, because water was always a gamble. And ale made everything feel slightly more cheerful. Then came the fry. Deep frying in the 1300s was a special kind of drama. The oil, usually pig fat, was reused until it could probably vote. It added flavor, which is a generous word for it, but the result was something hot, crispy, and oddly addictive. A fritter fresh out of the pan was a little piece of joy. Crispy edges, soft center, and a faint risk of third-degree burns. If you were lucky and rich, it might be dusted with imported sugar, a luxury that doubled as a social flex. For everyone else, a drizzle of honey or spice syrup did the trick. Either way, it was sweet enough to distract you from the rest of your diet, which mostly involved cabbage pretending to be other things. Fritters were street food. You'd grab one at a fair after church, or on market days when you needed a treat. And didn't mind grease on your tunic. Kids loved them. Adults loved them. Birds tried to steal them. They were fun, fast, and just indulgent enough to make you forget about the pickled turnips waiting at home. And yes, sometimes they were overcooked, or the apples were more sour than sweet, or the batter was suspiciously chewy. But when they were good, they were really good. One bite in, and suddenly you understood why people put up with medieval life. If apple fritters were the medieval version of a donut, then cheese curds were, well, sort of the medieval popcorn. Bite-sized, slightly squeaky, and wildly inconsistent. They weren't flashy. They didn't melt. They didn't stretch. In fact, they barely did anything at all. And that's what made them perfect. Let's be clear. Medieval cheese wasn't aiming for Instagram glory. It was made fast, eaten faster, and expected to survive long journeys, questionable storage, and the occasional goat stepping on it. Cheese curds were essentially baby cheese, the early fresh bits before the wheel hardened into something that could double as a building material. These little clumps of dairy joy were a byproduct of the cheese-making process. Farmers would separate milk into curds and whey using rennet, which sounds fancy until you realize it came from the stomach lining of a baby animal. But hey, it worked. The curds were pressed, lightly salted, and then that was it. Cheese curds. Sometimes they were soft, sometimes rubbery. Sometimes they squeaked on your teeth like they had a personality. But they were filling, portable, and weirdly satisfying. And in a time where snack usually meant old bread or cold broth, curds felt like a win. Monks loved them. Travelers packed them. Kids would eat them like candy, assuming the cows had been cooperative that week. You could fry them, crumble them over stews, or just eat them by the handful while pretending not to smell like the inside of a barn. Unlike many medieval foods, cheese curds didn't require a celebration or feast. They weren't saved for holidays or saints' days. They were just there, comforting, familiar, mildly chewy. The friend who always shows up never overperforms, but is weirdly reliable when everything else falls apart. Did they sometimes taste a little off? Sure. Freshness was a spectrum in the Middle Ages, but with enough salt and enthusiasm, most people didn't complain. Besides, in a world without refrigeration, your standards naturally adjust. So no, cheese curds weren't glamorous. But they were simple, hearty, and just indulgent enough to count as a treat. In a pinch, they were also excellent for bribing cats and small children. Turnips are not dessert. Let's just start there. But in the medieval world, where sugar was expensive, apples weren't always in season, and creative desperation was a major food group. Someone somewhere looked at a turnip and thought, what if this were pie? And so the turnip pie was born. Now, to be fair, it wasn't always awful. Sometimes it was even kind of good. Think mashed turnips, hopefully tender, blended with a bit of egg, maybe some honey or dried fruit if the cook was feeling generous, then baked inside a sturdy crust made of flour, water, and ambition. The result? Surprisingly edible at best. It was warm, a little sweet, and had that vaguely comforting root vegetable meat pudding vibe. At worst, it tasted like someone had mistaken livestock feed for a baking ingredient and just rolled with it. Turnip pies were popular for two main reasons. Turnips were cheap, and pie crust could hide a multitude of sins. Whether the turnips were overripe, undercooked, or suspiciously bitter, once you baked them into a pie and added a drizzle of honey, it became peasant cuisine with aspirations. Was it cheesecake? No, but it tried. And in medieval Europe, trying counted for a lot. You find these pies at fairs, feast tables, and in particularly enthusiastic monasteries where the monks had a little too much time and a lot of extra root vegetables. Some recipes added spices, nutmeg if the abbey was rich, pepper if the cook was chaotic. Occasionally, raisins made an appearance which only confused people further. Nobles didn't eat turnip pie unless they were slumming it for fun or pretending to relate to the common folk for political reasons. But for everyone else, it was dessert, sort of more like an afterthought with pastry. And yet, despite its questionable logic, the turnip pie endured. People liked it, or at least they didn't dislike it enough to stop making it. It was cheap, filling, and mildly sweet, which for medieval food made it basically revolutionary. If the medieval world had a comfort food MVP, it was the meat pasty, a handheld pie stuffed with seasoned meat, tucked into a folded crust and baked until it was golden brown or slightly scorched. Basically a medieval hot pocket minus the microwave, and plus a genuine sense of danger. The beauty of the pasty was its portability. You could eat it on the road, in the fields, or while watching a public execution, whatever the day demanded. Wrapped in a thick pastry crust, it stayed warm for a while and protected the contents from dirt, rats, and the occasional peasant sneeze. But let's talk about that filling. Meat, in this case, was a flexible term. If you lived near a manor or a hunting estate, you might get pork, mutton, or venison, actual recognizable meat. If not, well, options expanded dramatically. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog. Anything that once had legs or slithered could be diced, seasoned, and hidden inside pastry with plausible deniability. Spices were often used to enhance flavor, or more realistically, to distract you from it. Pepper, sage, and garlic helped, but they couldn't completely hide the fact that the meat had been resting for a few days longer than it should have. Still, in a time when refrigeration was a fantasy and lunch was often just bread and onions, a meaty pasty felt indulgent. There were even vegetarian versions filled with root vegetables, leeks or cheese for fasting days, or the particularly devout. But make no mistake, the meat ones were the crowd pleasers. They were greasy, hot, and comforting. You didn't ask what was inside, you just ate it and hoped the cook had been in a good mood. And in case you're wondering, yes, people sometimes marked the crust with initials or symbols to claim ownership, especially among miners and laborers. In some places, the crust was extra thick along one edge, so it could be held with dirty hands and then tossed to the spirits, or more realistically, to rats. So were they good? Often, yes. Were they mysterious? Always. But that was part of the charm. You didn't eat a meat pasty to feel safe. You ate it because it tasted good, and you were ready to accept the consequences. In a world where brushing your teeth meant rinsing with wine and hoping for the best, candied fennel seeds were the closest thing medieval folks had to breathing mints. Tiny, sugary, and vaguely herbal, they were part treats, part digestive aid and part dental hazard, all wrapped up in a single, oddly satisfying crunch. These little seeds were typically coated in a hard shell of sugar, which was no small feat in the Middle Ages. Sugar had to be imported, boiled, beaten, and poured by hand, meaning someone somewhere really believed in the potential of these tiny snacks. They were especially popular in noble households, where guests might be handed a small dish of them after dinner, to freshen the mouth and probably to distract from the mutton still clinging to their molars. Flavor-wise, fennel seeds had a strong licorice-like bite. You either loved them or politely swallowed them whole and nodded in gratitude. The sugar coating helped, But there was always that unmistakable herbal kick, the kind of thing that makes you feel both fancy and slightly confused. Candied seeds also had a job to do: digestion. People believed fennel helped settle the stomach, especially after a heavy meal involving 3 types of bird and an alarming amount of mead. Think of them as the medieval version of chewing gum crossed with Tums, but with more potential to chip a tooth. And yes, they were hard. Like crack your molar if you're too confident. Hard. You didn't chew candied fennel seeds casually. You tested one first, gently, bit down slowly, listened for cracking sounds, then committed. It was a risk-reward situation every time. While the rich popped them like medieval Tic Tacs, common folk occasionally got their hands on knockoff versions, usually involving honey, crushed herbs, and vague optimism. Not quite the same, but good enough to pretend. In the grand lineup of medieval junk food, candied fennel seeds were small but mighty. They didn't fill your belly, but they left a pleasant taste in your mouth and gave the illusion of refinement, even if you were covered in mud and still had goose grease on your tunic. The medieval desserts had a golden child. It was the honey cake. Sweet, dense, and prone to sticking to everything except your expectations. Honey cakes were what happened when bakers got ambitious and sugar was still locked in a castle treasury. Honey was the sweetener of the people, assuming those people had bees, access to bees, or weren't afraid of climbing trees and getting stung in the face. These cakes were usually made with flour, water, and generous spoonfuls of honey, or at least what passed for spoonfuls in an era where spoons were mostly used to fight off siblings. The result? A firm, chewy slab that could either be a delightful snack or a makeshift doorstop, depending on how long it had been sitting near the hearth. Spices were sometimes added if the household was feeling wealthy or showing off nutmeg, cloves, or cinnamon. Could give the honey cake a bit of flair. And by flair, we mean the ability to cause an entire village to talk about your recipe for a week. Dried fruits were also tossed in if they hadn't been stolen by the local children or turned into wine. Honey cakes were popular at feasts, festivals, and weddings, mostly because they could be made ahead of time, didn't spoil quickly, and could survive being dropped on the ground, stepped on, or thrown at someone in a mild food fight. They were also used as gifts, bribes, and occasionally passive-aggressive statements. Here, I made this for you. It's sweet, unlike your personality. Structurally, they weren't what you'd call delicate. Many resembled compact bricks. Slicing them required a sturdy knife, the quiet hope that no one was watching you struggle. Eating them was easier. Just don't expect a fluffy bite. These cakes were built for medieval life. Tough, durable, and coated in enough sticky honey to make your hands feel like you lost a battle with a beehive. But they were satisfying. They tasted like warmth and indulgence, like the rare moment you weren't chewing salted barley or chasing rats out of your cupboard. They were joy, wrapped in sugar, with just enough chew to count as cardio-fried fish skin cracklings. Possibly the most unexpectedly delightful snack to emerge from a culture that also thought eel pie was a good idea. These crispy, salty little strips weren't glamorous, but they were efficient. Waste not, want not. Especially when you're working with a fish that frankly smells like it's judging you. Let's be honest, no one set out to invent this. More likely, some thrifty cook was left staring at a pile of discarded fish skins and thought, what if we just fried it? A splash of hot fat later, and history was made, or at least something vaguely edible was born. Fish skin was plentiful, especially in coastal towns or near rivers where herring, cod, or whatever had been pulled out of the water was processed on site. The meat went to the stew pot, the heads went to the cat, and the skin that got thrown into a pan of bubbling oil and sizzled into submission. The result was surprisingly addictive. A thin, crispy snack that crunched like a dried leaf but tasted like a concentrated ocean. A pinch of salt elevated the experience. A hint of garlic or herbs. Well, now you are flirting with culinary excellence. These cracklings weren't just tasty, they were practical. Lightweight, non-perishable-ish, and high in fat. Exactly what a medieval body craved after a day of hauling firewood or defending sheep from someone else's sheep. Soldiers packed them. Sailors lived off them. Peasants sold them outside taverns for a few coins and the satisfaction of feeding drunk people something louder than their conversation. Did they sometimes still have scales? Yes. Did they occasionally curl into weird shapes that made you question your life choices? Also, yes. But by medieval standards, they were downright elegant, crispy, flavorful, and unlikely to give you dysentery. The only real drawback: smell. These things could announce their presence from 3 huts away. If you fried a batch indoors, your home would smell like Poseidon's laundry for a solid week. But you'd be forgiven because they tasted good. When life gave you stale bread and warm beer, you didn't cry. You made the most medieval snack imaginable: bread soaked in ale. Known variously as sops or trench toast, this humble creation was the original comfort food. Think French toast, but without the eggs, sugar, cinnamon, or joy. Here's how it worked. You took yesterday's bread, a kind that could double as building material, and dumped it into a bowl of ale. Not fancy craft ale with notes of citrus and a hoppy finish. No, this was flat, low-alcohol, medieval ale brewed in someone's smoky backroom with the hygiene standards of a barn owl. The bread absorbed the ale like a sponge with trust issues. It softened, swelled, and transformed from a jawbreaker into something vaguely edible. Was it tasty? In the right light, with a good mood and low expectations? Yes, kind of. It was warm, bready, and carried the gentle bitterness of fermented grain, which is to say, it didn't actively offend the palate. This snack was especially popular with the working class, people who didn't have time for multiple courses or cutlery. But I still needed calories that wouldn't fight back. Bread soaked in ale was quick, hearty, and just messy enough to feel like a real break from your daily chores. Sometimes people added extras: a sprinkle of herbs, a bit of cheese, or a fried egg if the hen felt generous that morning. On feast days, you might even get sops soaked in spiced ale, which basically meant the cook found a nutmeg shaving somewhere and got inspired. And like many medieval dishes, this one had a dual purpose. Not only was it food, it was also a way to stretch ingredients. Bread too stale to chew? Just soak it. All starting to turn? Pour it on bread and pretend it's intentional. Waste was for amateurs. The only downside: it didn't travel well. Once soaked, the bread turned into a kind of sloshy porridge cube. Eat it quickly or risk ending up with a mushy sponge in your bowl, and 1,000-year-old food metaphor for disappointment. Still, for a chilly evening by the fire, nothing beats a slice of ale bread mush, a moment of peace. If you've ever looked at a slice of bread and thought this would be better submerged in alcohol, congratulations. You and the medieval upper class have something in common. Sops and wine were one of the more refined, red, bizarrely specific snacks of the Middle Ages. A dessert, technically, or perhaps an experience. The concept was simple. Take bread, ideally toasted, or at least not completely stale, and dunk it in wine. Not just any wine, of course. Usually mulled, sweetened or spiced wine. Something warm, fragrant, and barely hiding the fact that it had been sitting in a clay jug since the last harvest. Once the bread was sufficiently drenched, it was served as a soft, spoonable delicacy. Nobles called it elegant. Everyone else quietly wondered if the cook had just run out of ideas. This was not finger food. It was the kind of dish you ate with a spoon, very slowly, while pretending to be interested in lute music. It appeared at banquets, late-night feasts, and the kind of awkward dinner where no one wanted to talk about politics, so instead they passed around soggy toast in a goblet. When done well, sops and wine were warm, comforting, and mildly intoxicating, a gentle end to a heavy meal. The wine added richness, the bread gave texture, and the spices made you feel like you were part of something fancier than it was. When done poorly, it was wet bread in a bowl. No amount of cinnamon could cover up the feeling that you were chewing on a medieval mistake. Sometimes dried fruits or nuts were added for flair, sometimes cheese, occasionally a whole egg. At that point, it stopped being a snack and became a culinary guessing game. Peasants made their own versions, usually using cheap vinegar or ale instead of wine. It wasn't dessert, it was dinner or breakfast, or whatever you could call a meal that made you both full and confused. Still, sops and wine had staying power. They were warm, they were filling, and they gave medieval people a taste of indulgence, even if it did taste like sponge soaked in mulled regret. In the Middle Ages, dried fruit was a prize treat, sugary. exotic and shelf-stable enough to survive an entire crusade. But let's be clear, this wasn't your modern trail mix with cute resealable packaging. Medieval dried fruit had one job to last. Taste was optional. Texture aggressively chewy. Dental damage? Practically a guarantee. Let's start with the basics. You had your usual suspects. Raisins, figs, dates. And if you were really fancy, imported prunes. These were fruits that had been sun-dried, smoke-dried, or in some cases just forgotten on a windowsill until they no longer qualified as moist. They were wrinkled, tough, and alarmingly dense, kind of like an edible time capsule from the last harvest. The upside? The dried fruit was sweet, really sweet. Concentrated sugar. Sugars turned these shriveled little things into medieval candy. Nobles loved them, monks hoarded them, and children treated them like rare loot from the kitchen. The downside? Chewing them was like fighting your own jaw muscles. Figs came with seeds that doubled as medieval dental floss. Dates were sticky enough to glue your molars together. Raisins stuck in your teeth for hours. There was no such thing as snacking quietly still. Dried fruit had its moments. It was used in pies, added to porridge, or chopped up and thrown into honey cakes to create the illusion of variety. Rich folks might wrap them in pastry, drizzle them with rose water, or soak them in wine like they were trying to impress a guest from Florence. For commoners, getting your hands on dried fruit was a special occasion, usually a holiday, a wedding, or the one day a year someone remembered you existed. When that happened, you'd eat it slowly, respectfully, possibly while hiding in the barn so you didn't have to share. Storage was easy. Dried fruit didn't spoil quickly and was often kept in little cloth sacks or clay pots. It hardened over time, yes, but that just turned it into a longer-lasting snack, or possibly a projectile if you were creative and had younger siblings. In short, dried fruit was sweet, luxurious, and faintly dangerous. It stuck with you, sometimes literally. You wake up hungry. You want something hearty, something fried, something that might bite back. Enter the blood pudding ball, a medieval snack so dense, so bold, so unapologetically iron-rich. It makes modern sausage rolls look like timid breadsticks, born out of the noble tradition of using every part of the animal. These savory spheres were proof that waste does not want not, even if what you're not wasting is blood. Let's unpack it. First, you collect fresh animal blood, usually pig, though honestly, any blood would do in a pinch. You then mix it with oats, onions, suet, that's beef fat, and spices. Once that morbid porridge reaches just the right level of grim stickiness, you shape it into balls and fry them in sizzling fat until the outside crisps up like it has something to prove. The result? Dark, crispy orbs of protein-packed sustenance with a rich, earthy flavor, which is code for you'll taste iron and mystery for the rest of the day. They were best served hot, fresh from the skillet, though sometimes they were eaten cold if your appetite outweighed your fear of congealed fat. Nobles might dress them up with pepper or serve them with eggs and ale. Peasants, they were just happy not to be chewing on boiled cabbage again. Blood pudding balls weren't elegant, but they were practical, easy to carry, high in calories, and alarmingly filling. If you ate 2, you could skip lunch. If you ate 4, you were probably a blacksmith or trying to win a dare. These snacks were common at fairs, markets, and roadside stalls where everything smelled like livestock and ambition. They were especially popular in colder months because what warms the soul like fried coagulation? Of course, blood pudding balls weren't for everyone. Some folks didn't love the texture. Others didn't love the concept. But in a world where survival came first and flavor came somewhere around 12th, these meaty little morsels earned their place in the medieval junk food hall of fame. Forget everything you know about pancakes. These weren't fluffy stacks with maple syrup and whipped cream. Medieval pancakes were thinner, tougher, and cooked in enough lard to make your arteries consider early retirement. But they got the job done. And in a world where your other breakfast option was thin soup that sat about its life, they were kind of a treat. Made from a humble mix of flour, eggs, and water or ale, these pancakes were poured onto a sizzling iron griddle coated in bubbling pig fat. No non-stick pans, no portion control. You just ladled and hoped. The result? A flat, uneven circle with crispy, browned edges and a slightly chewy center. The kind of pancake that could survive a horseback ride and still be mostly edible when you arrived. Sometimes it was a little burnt. Sometimes it was a little raw. Sometimes charmingly. Well, flavor depended on what you had. A splash of ale added a nice tang. A spoonful of honey. Luxurious. A sprinkle of herbs or onions. Adventurous. But most of the time it was just pancake and grease, served hot and inhaled like you just run from a tax collector. These pancakes were democratic. Everyone ate them. Peasants, nobles, monks, merchants. Some layered them with cheese, some dunked them in broth, and others just rolled them up and called it a day. You could eat them sweet, savory, or scorched beyond recognition. And if you had leftovers, stack them up and pretend they were cake or armor. They were especially popular during Lent and other fasting days when meat was off limits. Pancakes became a loophole, fried, filling, and somehow both humble and indulgent. Plus, they made excellent vessels for disguising other ingredients that had no business being in your mouth. And while they might not have been beautiful, medieval pancakes had staying power. They didn't need praise. They just needed a hot pan and a willing stomach. Somewhere between a snack and a sacrament, we find the medieval wafer, a thin, crisp, suspiciously light biscuit that danced the line between dessert and dental challenge. Wafers were everywhere, outside churches, at village fairs, in the hands of monks, and occasionally floating in your soup like a flat, holy crouton. Let's clarify. We're not talking about chocolate-dipped cream-filled delights. Medieval wafers were made of flour, water, eggs, and not much else. If you were feeling fancy, you could add a dash of honey or rose water, but most stuck with the basics. Thin batter poured onto hot metal wafer irons, pressed between two scorching plates like a medieval panini press. The result? Something that looked like it belonged in a communion ceremony, and tasted like crispy paper with ambitions. Wafers were popular because they were portable, fast to make, and best of all, they could be sold in massive quantities for a tidy profit. Vendors would set up outside churches on feast days, waving stacks of warm wafers at the faithful as they left Mass. By now, Sin Later was not the slogan, but it was the general vibe. They were often shaped with religious symbols, floral patterns, or the vague imprint of a saint's face, depending on the iron mold and how tired the baker was. These designs didn't enhance the flavor, but they did give you something to stare at while chewing thoughtfully and pretending you weren't disappointed. Structurally, the wafers were delicate. They cracked if you looked at them wrong and shattered if you tried to break them cleanly. Storing them was a challenge. Transporting them even more so, which made eating them outdoors a high-stakes affair involving crumbs, wind, and regret. Still, they were beloved. Light, crispy, and vaguely celebratory, wafers were the medieval version of treating yourself without completely wrecking your digestion or your wallet. For nobles, they came stacked with fruit or layered with soft cheese. For everyone else, they were sold by the dozen in street stalls, and eaten immediately before they disintegrated into edible confetti. Suck it. Even the name sounds sticky. This medieval treat was essentially fruit that had been boiled into submission, drowned in syrup, and sealed in a jar like a sweet little hostage. Think candied oranges, dates, or ginger coated in enough sugar to make your teeth tingle and your conscience whisper. You shouldn't be eating this, but you did because it was delicious, and probably imported. And also, you didn't have much else. Suck it wasn't for the everyday peasant chewing his seventh onion of the week. No, this was elite-tier snacking, the kind of indulgence served in noble halls or gifted by the wealthy to say I like you, but not enough to give you land. Sugar was expensive and fruits weren't always in season, so such it was reserved for special occasions like weddings or royal visits or Wednesday. If you were outrageously rich and out of control, the preparation process was ambitious. First, you'd boil the fruit in syrup, maybe honey, maybe refined sugar if your spice merchant owed you a favor. Then you drain it, let it dry a bit, and repeat several times, because once wasn't enough. You weren't just preserving fruit, you were declaring war on moisture itself eventually. The result was a glossy, jewel-toned bite of candy, chewy, intense, and so sweet could probably be weaponized in large enough doses. Some versions were soft and syrupy, served in ornate glass jars. Others were dry, rolled in extra sugar, and handed out as dainty little cubes of medieval hyperglycemia. But make no mistake, such it comes with status. It said you had access to sugar trade routes, and at least one servant dedicated solely to stirring things that didn't want to be stirred. Sake trays were passed around after banquets like edible gold coins. Guests took one piece, smiled graciously, and immediately regretted not grabbing three. As for commoners, they watched from the kitchen and maybe licked a spoon if no one was looking. So was it worth it? Honestly, yes. It was one of the few medieval snacks that genuinely felt like dessert. It was rich, refined, and just extravagant enough to make up for the fact that dinner had included boiled something. A fried eel. The grand finale of medieval junk food. A dish so strangely beloved it made its way from peasant hearts to royal banquets without once stopping to ask, "Wait, am I really the best option here?" Yes, it was. Eel was everywhere in medieval Europe. Rivers and streams practically writhed with them, and they were easy to catch, cheap to cook, and when fried, surprisingly crispy. Slippery when raw, bonier than expected, and shaped like the villain in a fish-themed horror story. The eel was still eaten by the bucket load. Why? Because it was tasty. And more importantly, it wasn't turnips. To prepare it, you'd first have to catch the eel, usually at night, when they slithered through shallow waters like sentient noodles. Then came the unpleasant task of skinning them, which was less like prepping a fish and more like wrestling a wet rope that didn't want to die. Once subdued, the eels were chopped, seasoned, if you were feeling bold, and tossed into hot fat until the skin crisped up and the meat firmed into something vaguely appealing. The finished product. A crunchy, savory bite with a rich, slightly oily flavor. Like if calamari and chicken had an identity crisis in a tavern kitchen. Fried eel was served at fairs, feasts, roadside inns, and believe it or not, during religious fasts. That's right, eel wasn't technically meat, so it slipped through the dietary loopholes like itself. Monks ate it. Nobles flaunted it. Kings had it stuffed into pies and paraded across banquets like the sea serpent it always wanted to be. Sure, it had bones, lots of them. And yes, it occasionally wriggled long after death. But if you could get past that and the haunting feeling that you were eating a villain from a cautionary folk tale, fried eel was genuinely delicious. Crispy skin, tender inside, and just greasy enough to make you feel like you were living a little too dangerously for a Wednesday afternoon. Today, it might seem bizarre. Back then, it was a delicacy, a slippery little miracle that kept bellies full and menus weird. In the ancient world, Mesopotamia stood at the crossroads of mystery and mythology, and nowhere was this more evident than in how they viewed dreams. To the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, a dream wasn't just a private, meaningless experience. It was a divine telegram, a supernatural email sent directly from the gods to the subconscious. And ignoring it, that was like leaving a message from Enlil unread. Dangerous. By around 2500 BCE, Mesopotamians had developed a full-blown system of dream interpretation, recorded on clay tablets in cuneiform script. These weren't bedtime novelties. They were used in statecraft, medicine, and religious rituals. Kings would delay wars if a troubling dream suggested bad omens. Farmers wouldn't plant crops if they saw a goat fly across the sky in their sleep. The world, they believed, was constantly speaking. It was your job to listen with your eyes closed. Professional dream interpreters, called Baru priests, were the ancient equivalent of Freudian analysts, minus the couch. They were trained in libraries of omen text, like the Ishkar Zaka, an elaborate dream manual that categorized dreams and their meanings in sometimes absurd but eerily precise ways. Dreaming of eating dates? Good omen. Dreaming of your teeth falling out? Expect death in the family. Dreaming of sex with a goddess? Well, congrats. You're either divinely favored or cursed with arrogance. These dream books didn't claim to guess meanings. They presented cause and effect as if dreams were equations. A equals B. See a snake. Expect betrayal. Fall from a rooftop. A lawsuit is coming. The world of dreams was logical, just operating on divine logic, which was far stranger to human reason. But the Mesopotamians didn't stop at interpretation. They practiced dream incubation too. If a ruler wanted guidance from the gods, he might sleep in a temple under special circumstances, fasting, cleansing rituals, perhaps a few incense offerings, and wait for a revelatory dream. The idea was that certain environments made the divine connection stronger, clearer, and less prone to nightmares about drunk goats. For Mesopotamians, the dream world was not a mystery to solve. It was a realm to navigate with caution, reverence, and a very large clay tablet library. They believed the gods were always speaking. You just had to be asleep to hear them. In ancient Egypt, dreams weren't merely nightly occurrences. They were considered sacred texts in motion. The Egyptians believed that dreams were messages from the gods, ancestors, or even from one's own K, the spiritual double of a person. Every dream, good or bad, came with intent. It could warn, bless, instruct, or terrify by the time of the New Kingdom. Circa 1550-1070 BCE, the Egyptians had begun recording their interpretations in what would become some of history's earliest dream manuals. One of the most famous examples is the Ramesside Dream Book, written on papyrus and discovered in the village of Deir el-Medina. This wasn't light reading. It's essentially a divine diagnostic tool, listing hundreds of dreams and interpreting each based on whether the outcome will be favorable or disastrous. The logic, however, was not always intuitive. For example, if a man sees himself eating crocodile flesh in a dream, it means he will become a high official. Strange, yes, but in Egyptian cosmology, the crocodile was tied to the god Sobek, who embodied strength and power. Eating crocodiles meant absorbing divine traits. That's a promotion-worthy omen. Each entry in the dream book started with a phrase. If a man sees himself, followed by a symbolic scenario, these weren't general guesses. They were drawn from centuries of ritual knowledge, personal visions, and temple tradition, and the interpretations were often binary, marked as good or bad in red and black ink. If your dream was classified as bad, it was time to light some incense and beg a priest to intervene in temple complexes. Especially those serving healing deities like Serket or Thoth sometimes offered services in dream incubation where supplicants would sleep in the temple and await guidance or healing through visions. The idea was to open a divine channel through purification, prayer, and controlled sleep. This wasn't mere superstition. It was healthcare, divination, and theology rolled into one night's rest. Dreams also influenced magic and medicine. Amulets might be prescribed to fend off recurring nightmares. Specific rituals could be performed to erase a dream, much like you'd erase a curse. For the ancient Egyptians, the sleeping mind was not idle. It was a stage where gods, demons, and the spirits of the dead could appear and offer glimpses into hidden truths. If you had the wisdom and a priest to decode them in the ancient Greek world, dreams were more than divine whispers. They were clinical appointments with the gods. Central to this belief was the practice of incubation, a ritual where individuals would sleep inside a temple in hopes of receiving a healing vision. And no deity was more closely tied to this practice than Asclepius, the god of medicine. At temples known as Asclepia, which dotted the Greek world from Epidaurus to Pergamon, the sick, the hopeful, and the desperate came seeking cures. But instead of pills or potions, they were prescribed sleep, sacred, intentional, and performed under specific spiritual conditions. Before entering the temple's sleeping quarters or abaton, a person would undergo purification, bathing, fasting, and sometimes sacrificing an animal. Only after these rituals could they lay down on a stone bed and wait for God to appear in a dream. The results? According to inscriptions and ancient testimonies, some patients dreamed of Asclepius touching them with his staff, or of snakes, his sacred animal, slithering over their bodies. They would awaken healed, or at least believe they had received divine instructions on what to do next. Whether these dreams were real, psychosomatic, or placebo-driven, the effects were profound. Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, acknowledged the value of dreams in diagnosis. They didn't dismiss them as nonsense. In fact, they believed the body could reveal its state through symbolic visions. A dream of flowing water might suggest kidney issues. A dream of being crushed could point to a chest ailment. In Hippocratic texts, Dreams were often classified as either natural or divine. Natural dreams were caused by diet, digestion, or emotional stress. Divine ones, a whole other category. Direct messages from the gods or the cosmos. But not all dream interpreters wore white robes and carried scrolls. The Honorocriti, or dream readers, were the real stars of the public square. Using dream manuals, omens, and an enormous supply of interpretive flair that translated dreams into warnings, blessings, or instructions. The most famous of these guides was the Honorocritica, written by Artemidorus of Daldis in the 2nd century CE, a book still studied centuries later. In Greece, the dream wasn't just a nighttime experience. It was a bridge between mortal and divine, body and soul, illness and healing. And if you were lucky, you'd wake up with a cure and maybe a snake curled at your feet. Throughout the ancient world, one category of dream carried more weight than all others. The prophetic dream. These weren't just messages. They were warnings, revelations, or calls to action. For cultures spanning Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and beyond, prophetic dreams were sacred transmissions from a higher plane, direct links to gods, fate, or the mysterious mechanisms of the cosmos. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, prophetic dreams were a recognized and respected channel of divine communication. The Old Testament is filled with examples. Think of Joseph, son of Jacob, who dreamt of sheaves of wheat bowing before his own, a symbol of his future rise to power. Later, as an interpreter of Pharaoh's dreams in Egypt, he predicted 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. That one dream of cows, fat and thin, altered the course of Egypt's economy. Joseph didn't just read dreams. He became a national strategist by doing so. Likewise, in Mesopotamia, kings often received dreams that foretold victory, disaster, or divine favor. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal claimed he saw the gods in his dreams, guiding him to success in war and governance. Prophetic dreams were seen as confirmation that a ruler had divine legitimacy, essential in a world where the line between king and deity was thin. The Greeks, too, recognized this prophetic potential. Dreams were categorized. Those from the subconscious were called enhypnia, but those that revealed truth were called honoroi alethenoi. These were not taken lightly. Before major decisions, founding a city, declaring war, launching a voyage, Greek leaders often consulted dreams or those trained to interpret them. Dreams were so revered that they had their own minor deities, the honoroi, winged spirits who entered the sleeper's mind with messages from the gods. Even the Romans, typically more pragmatic, took prophetic dreams seriously. The Emperor Augustus was said to have dreamt of future glory, and even Nero consulted dream interpreters during his reign. Perhaps not enough, considering how that turned out, the Roman general Scipio Africanus, before defeating Hannibal, reportedly had a dream of victory sent by the spirits of his ancestors. In ancient societies, prophetic dreams weren't side notes. They were tools of power, instruments of policy, and evidence of divine selection. The fate of nations, the health of empires, and the rise of legends often began with something as simple as a whispered vision in the dark. While Greek Asclepian temples are the most famous, ancient dream incubation was not exclusive to Greece and Anatolia. Modern-day Turkey dream healing thrived in a rich blend of Hittite, Phrygian, and later Greco-Roman traditions, with temples and sacred sites dedicated to facilitating contact with divine forces through sleep. The most fascinating example comes from the cult of Men, a Phrygian lunar god associated with healing, cycles, and natural dreams. His temples often sat on hills facing the night sky, as if positioned to catch lunar messages beamed down into the dreams of supplicants, people suffering from physical ailments, spiritual unrest, or uncertainty about their futures would come to these shrines to practice incubation, ritual sleep with the hope of receiving a curative or guiding dream. The process was similar to what we saw in Asclepian practices, but Anatolian incubation had its own twists. Worshippers would sometimes walk labyrinth paths, or sleep beneath celestial carvings, believing their proximity to sacred geometry would focus divine messages. Music, incense, and chants were often used to tune the sleeper's mind to the divine frequency. This wasn't sleep for rest, it was sleep as spiritual reception. Texts from the region also mentioned dream priest, spiritual specialists trained to guide and interpret these visions. Some would even seed dreams, suggesting imagery or symbols before sleep to shape the encounter. For example, someone wanting a vision of their future child might sleep with a carved fertility idol under their pillow. If they dream of a lion, the priest might declare that a brave son was on the way. If they dreamed of rain, a daughter blessed by growth and wisdom. Hittite records also reference divine encounters in dreams. Especially among royalty, kings and queens received strategic advice, healing knowledge, and occasionally harsh warnings from the gods in their sleep. One dream reportedly instructed a queen to adopt a foreign goddess into her shrine, an early example of divine diplomacy. Dream incubation in Anatolia wasn't just personal, it was communal and cosmic. Pilgrims traveled long distances, often forming temporary healing communities bound not by blood, but by shared vulnerability and hope, and through sleep, they believed the gods could reset the course of their lives. In Anatolia, dreaming wasn't passive. It was an act of ritual participation, where healing and prophecy flowed not from logic, but from the silent language of sleep. By the 2nd century CE, the ancient art of dream interpretation had matured into a disciplined craft, and one man took it upon himself to systematize it all. Artemidorus of Daldis, a Greek from Asia Minor. Artemidorus wrote the Onira Critica, the most comprehensive and influential dream manual of the ancient world. And unlike mystical scribes who veiled everything in divine mystery, Artemidorus approached dreams with the methodical precision of a scholar and the curiosity of a streetwise psychologist. The Onira Critica wasn't some mystical pamphlet. It was a 5-book tome written in clear Greek, filled with thousands of dream scenarios and their meanings, culled from personal interviews, temple records, and public performances. Artemidorus claimed he spent decades collecting dream accounts from people of all walks of life. Sailors, merchants, prostitutes, soldiers. His logic? If you want to understand the soul of a culture, listen to its dreams. He organized dreams into categories, actions, and animals, professions, bodily functions, even types of relationships. Dreaming of flying, that could suggest freedom or arrogance. Dreaming of being naked in public, depending on your social class, it might mean shame or future power. Dreaming of teeth falling out, that meant a loss, usually of relatives. That one seems to have stuck through the centuries. But what makes Artemidorus unique is that he emphasized context. Unlike earlier dream books, which gave static meanings, Artemidorus stressed the importance of the dreamer's status, gender, occupation, and current life circumstances. A wealthy man dreaming of a shipwreck meant business troubles. A poor man dreaming of the same thing might find new fortune. Interpretation wasn't one size fits all. It was tailored, almost like early psychotherapy. Artemidorus also tackled symbolism head-on. He understood that dreams used metaphor and irony. A dream of dying didn't mean death. It could mean renewal. A dream of sex didn't always refer to desire. It might signal dominance, power struggles, or guilt. His interpretations walked a strange line between deeply logical and incredibly bizarre. The Onira Critica wasn't just a curiosity. It was used for centuries across the Roman Empire and Byzantine world. It influenced medieval dream interpreters and was translated into Arabic, keeping the flame alive long after classical temples fell. With Artemidorus, the dream became a text to be studied, decoded not just for prophecy, but for insight. He may not have believed dreams came from gods, but he certainly believed they came from somewhere deep, strange, and worth exploring. Not all dreams in the ancient world were gifts from the gods. Some were terrors from the depths. Dark, haunting visions believed to come from restless spirits, demonic forces, or even the underworld itself. These weren't seen as mere bad nights of sleep. They were warnings, punishments, or omens of things to come. The Babylonians were among the first to differentiate dreams of divine origin from those that came from malevolent forces. If a dream caused fear, illness, or distress, it was considered polluted, and a priest would be called to perform apotropaic rituals, cleansing spells, offerings, or symbolic actions designed to neutralize the dream's effect. For example, if someone dreamed of being chased by a demon, the interpreter might recommend sleeping with a protective amulet under the pillow or burning cedarwood incense to ward off evil spirits. The Egyptians also had a well-developed idea of nightmare prevention. Certain dreams were believed to be caused by malicious entities, including the dead. Amulets bearing the eye of Horus or images of Bez, the dwarf god who protected households from dark forces, were worn to guard against these attacks. Some people even recited dream erasing spells upon waking, treating the nightmare as a contagious curse that had to be spoken out of existence before it could manifest in the physical world in Greek thought. Nightmares often signified a message not from the Olympians, but from chthonic deities, gods of the earth and the underworld. Hades, Persephone, and even the terrifying Erin's Furies could appear in dreams to express divine displeasure or signal a crime left unpunished. Dreamers who ignored these warnings did so at their peril. The philosopher Plato in the Republic even described the dream as a battleground between reason and appetite, where the lower parts of the soul ran wild. For him, the nightmare was not just a spiritual warning, but a psychological one, an indication that your inner self was out of balance. Even the Romans, practical as ever, feared dreams of certain animals like owls, snakes, or wolves, as signs of impending death, betrayal, or war. They believed the dead could visit the living through dreams, sometimes to warn, sometimes to accuse. In every culture, nightmares were more than bad dreams. They were seen as cosmic red flags, reminders that the seen and unseen worlds were always connected, and that even in sleep there was no true escape from fate. In the ancient world, dreams weren't just spiritual. They were political assets. Rulers, priests, generals, and prophets often weaponized dreams to justify decisions, sway public opinion, or consolidate authority. When the gods spoke in sleep, those in power were quick to say they spoke to me. Take Alexander the Great, for instance. Before he conquered Egypt, he reportedly dreamed of the god Ammonius welcoming him as a son. Upon arrival at the Siwa oasis, the local oracle confirmed the dream, declaring Alexander a divine offspring. Was the dream real? Was it staged? It didn't matter. The message solidified his rule and painted him as more than mortal, a living god in the eyes of his troops and subjects. Dreams were especially useful during political transitions or uncertain times. In ancient Rome, Augustus claimed to have dreamed of a great victory at Actium, which he won against Mark Antony and Cleopatra afterward. This dream was immortalized in literature and coins, turning it into a sacred narrative. Later emperors followed suit. If the gods supported your dream, who dared oppose your actions? Priests and oracles often played into this. Dream interpretation became a theological tool, especially when it aligned with the interests of a ruler or temple elite. Suppose a rebellious governor dreamt of disaster. The priest might interpret it as divine punishment for challenging imperial authority. On the flip side, dreams of fruitfulness and victory, interpreted correctly, could embolden leaders to begin campaigns, raise taxes, or enact reforms. This wasn't limited to men. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt claimed in temple inscriptions that her birth was foretold in a dream by the god Ammonius, who appeared her mother and prophesied divine rulership. By framing her reign as destined in dreams, she strengthened her legitimacy in a male-dominated throne. Prophets in the Hebrew Bible also used dreams to challenge kings. Daniel, for instance, interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a great statue, forecasting the rise and fall of empires. It wasn't just dream reading, it was geopolitics wrapped in allegory. In every civilization, dreams allowed leaders to say, "This is not just my will. It is the will of heaven." Whether divine revelation or calculated propaganda, dreams were a powerful currency, turning the subconscious into statecraft, one vision at a time. Though the ancient temples have crumbled and the priests of dream now sleep beneath layers of dust, the legacy of ancient dream interpretation lives on, whispering through time, science, and psychology. Much of what we believe today about dreams, our fascination with symbolism, recurring motifs, even nightmares, has roots in ancient frameworks that tried to make sense of the sleeping mind. The medieval world inherited these traditions wholesale. Islamic scholars translated the Urnira Critica of Artemidorus into Arabic, refining and expanding on it. In Islamic mysticism, dreams became deeply respected as means of divine guidance. Meanwhile, Christian monks and theologians began cataloging dreams of saints and martyrs, visions that often predicted future miracles or divine justice. The same structure remained as sleep as a portal to the sacred, dreams as veiled messages, and interpreters as the bridge between human and divine. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, and we meet Sigmund Freud, who, despite rejecting religious interpretations, borrowed heavily from the symbolic structure pioneer millennia before in the interpretation of dreams, 1899. Freud argued that dreams expressed repressed desires and fears, but he still used ancient tools. Metaphor, symbol, narrative. His protege, Carl Jung, went further, describing the dream world as populated by archetypes, universal figures like the shadow, the hero, and the wise old man. Eerily similar to figures one might find in a Greek temple or Babylonian omen list. Even modern neuroscience, while stripping dreams of their mysticism, still respects their complexity. Dream sleep, lucid dreaming, and the influence of trauma or memory on dream content. These ideas echo ancient notions that dreams reflect both the health of the body and the state of the soul. Pop culture, too, carries on the torch. From film and literature to tarot and New Age spirituality, dreams remain a source of fascination. Whether it's a horror film based on sleep paralysis or a dream journal app promising self-discovery, the ancient idea still pulses beneath that what we see in Sleep Matters. In the end, the ancients may not have had brain scans or sleep labs, but they understood something we still chase today. Dreams are not random. They are stories, signals, or shadows whispered in the language of gods, ancestors, or ourselves. The question remains the same across time. What is your dream trying to tell you? In the mid-19th century, the United States was a country stretching at the seams. By 1860, California had been a state for a full decade, but it often felt more like a distant cousin than a sibling. The eastern half of the country buzzed with cities, telegraphs, and railroads, while the western frontier remained rugged, remote, and painfully disconnected. A letter from New York to San Francisco could take 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes longer if storms, delays, or bandits got in the way. And that's if it arrived at all. Mail routes at the time were as convoluted as they were inefficient. The most common path involved ships carrying mail down the Atlantic, across the Isthmus of Panama, then back up the Pacific coast. A journey filled with delays, tropical diseases, and logistical nightmares. Meanwhile, the overland route via stagecoach was slow, perilous, and frequently bogged down by muddy trails, snowbound passes, or attacks from outlaws and hostile terrain. This lag wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a political problem. The federal government worried that California, increasingly isolated, might drift away in spirit or loyalty. In an era where secession was already on the horizon, maintaining unity across the continent was not just ideal, it was urgent. Entrepreneurs and visionaries began floating bold solutions, none bolder than the idea of creating a central relay system using the one thing the American West had in abundance: open land and fast horses. If skilled riders could gallop across the country in shifts, swapping horses at stations every 10 to 15 miles maybe, just maybe they could cut delivery time from weeks to just 10 days. It was an insane proposal. The route would be nearly 2,000 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. It would cross mountains, deserts, rivers, and territories that had barely been mapped. There would be extreme heat, freezing nights, and the ever-present danger of ambush. But if it worked, it would be the fastest communication line between East and West. The problem was clear. America was expanding faster than its infrastructure. And so, with a mix of desperation, ambition, and pure frontier daring, a solution galloped into history, one saddlebag at a time. The Pony Express was about to be born. The Pony Express didn't just materialize out of the dust. It was the brainchild of 3 ambitious businessmen from the freight and stagecoach firm Russell, Majors, and Waddell. Based in Missouri, the trio William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell were already veterans in the overland shipping world. Their company was responsible for hauling freight and government supplies across the wild frontier. But in 1860, they set their sights on a far more radical goal: speeding up mail delivery to California in the shortest time possible. At the time, Russell in particular was feeling the pressure. His reputation was on the line due to financial scandals and failed ventures. He saw the Pony Express not just as a patriotic service, but as a personal redemption arc. a way to restore his name and gain favor with the government. If they could prove their relay system worked, they hoped to land a lucrative federal mail contract. Alexander Majors brought the logistics brain. A devout and meticulous planner, he demanded discipline from his employees, even requiring riders and station masters to swear oaths against drinking and cursing. He also developed a highly structured system for the express. Stations would be built every 10 to 15 miles, larger home stations every 75 to 100 miles, and the entire route would be maintained like a military operation. William B. Waddell, the quietest of the trio, provided the legal and financial backbone. While Russell was the salesman and Majors the operational genius, Waddell kept the books and ensured the company stayed afloat, at least for a while. Together, the three poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into the venture. They bought over 400 horses, hired more than 80 riders, and built roughly 190 stations across the most remote parts of the frontier. They knew it was a gamble, and they knew the route would be grueling. But they also knew that whoever solved the communication crisis would earn a permanent place in American history. And so, without any government funding, they launched the service themselves. It was a bold move, financially reckless, logistically insane, and yet deeply symbolic of American grit. In April of 1860, the Pony Express was ready to ride. The race against time and terrain was on. Creating the Pony Express route was like building a fragile bridge across a continent with no safety net and almost no margin for error. The full distance spanned nearly 2,000 miles, stretching from St. Joseph, Imo, to Sacramento, California, through a dizzying array of landscapes, rolling plains, mountain ranges, high deserts, and dangerous river crossings to make this insane idea work. The founders built a chain of approximately 190 relay stations, spaced every 10 to 15 miles, about the distance a horse could ride at full speed before tiring. Every 75 to 100 miles, a home station provided rest and shelter for the riders, where they could sleep, eat, and hand off the mail to a fresh rider. But the real backbone of the express was the horses, more than 400 in all. They were chosen not for looks or stature, but for sheer speed and stamina and ease. Fleet-footed thoroughbreds ruled the prairie in the rugged W compact, and hardy Mustangs carry the mail across the mountains and desert. These were the Ferraris of the frontier. Riders would gallop at full speed, jump off mid-stride, and leap onto a fresh mount in a matter of seconds. Each station had to be manned, stocked, and secure. Some were little more than sod huts or wooden shacks. Others were fortified structures surrounded by barbed fencing and guarded by station keepers with rifles. Supplies, water, feed, and food had to be transported in advance. This meant months of preparation, and it all had to be done in some of the most remote, inhospitable land in America. Weather posed one of the biggest threats. Riders would endure snowstorms in the Sierra Nevada, sandstorms in the Utah desert, and brutal summer heat on the Nebraska plains. Wild animals, swollen rivers, and collapsing trails were daily hazards. And then there were human dangers, bandits, outlaws, and the rising tensions of conflict with Native American tribes. But despite the chaos, the system worked. With riders swapping every 75,100 miles and fresh horses every 1,015, the mail flew across the continent in as little as 10 days, a revolutionary speed at the time. It was a logistical miracle stitched together by courage, sweat, and raw determination. In a land where miles meant isolation, the Pony Express stitched together a fragile thread of connection, one hoofbeat at a time. On April 3, 1860, the Pony Express made its historic debut. In St. Joseph, Missouri, a crowd gathered at the stables of the Pikes Peak Stables building, buzzing with excitement. The inaugural rider, most likely Johnny Fry, though records are somewhat disputed, mounted his horse, took the leather mochila, a specially designed mail pouch, and dashed off westward at breakneck speed. The crowd cheered, cannons fired, and just like that, a new chapter in American history thundered to life. The mailbag Fry carried weighed around 20 pounds, filled with letters, newspapers, and telegrams bound for California. A telegraph message had already been wired from Washington, D.C., and would now travel the rest of the way on horseback, symbolizing the union of technology and raw human effort. At the same moment, a counterpart in Sacramento rode eastward, launching the bidirectional relay. Between them stood nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness, 190 stations, and some of the harshest terrain North America had to offer, and they planned to cross it in just 10 days. Each rider on the route carried the mochila from one station to the next, leaping off a lathered horse and onto a fresh one in under 2 minutes. The mochila was ingeniously designed. It had 4 locked pouches and could be quickly slipped over the saddle horn without unstrapping anything. Speed was everything. Riders were expected to maintain a pace of 10 miles per hour, even in the dead of night, through rain, snow, or hostile territory. Despite the chaos, the first ride succeeded. The mail from Missouri reached Sacramento in 9 days and 23 hours. Triumph. Newspapers hailed it as a miracle of modern communication, and the legend of the Pony Express was born almost overnight. Though only a few letters rode in that first mochila, the symbolic impact was immense. It wasn't just about getting mail from point A to B. It was about possibility. About proving that this wild, fractured continent could be connected, that man and horse could outpace isolation. For the riders, it was the beginning of a dangerous, thrilling chapter. For the nation, it was a taste of something new, instant communication, faster than anyone thought possible. The West had just gotten a little smaller. The lifeblood of the Pony Express wasn't the horses, the stations, or even the mochila. It was the riders. A band of young, wiry daredevils who defied weather, wilderness, and war to deliver the mail. They weren't just couriers, they were living legends in the making. The typical Pony Express rider was no older than 18, often closer to 16. They were light, usually under 125 pounds, so as not to weigh down the horses. Speed and endurance were everything. The now famous recruitment ads allegedly read wanted. Young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18 must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. While the wording is likely apocryphal, the spirit behind it was absolutely real. These young men rode 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses at every station but never resting until they'd passed the mochila to the next rider. They often rode at night through torrential rain, snowstorms, or scorching heat. They carried revolvers and rifles, but against bandits or hostile attacks, their best defense was speed. Many of them traveled alone, unarmed, relying entirely on their ability to outrun trouble. Some riders became folk heroes. Pony Bob Haslam once rode 380 miles in under 2 days to deliver mail during a violent Paiute uprising, despite being wounded by arrows. William Buffalo Bill Cody, who would later become a Wild West showman, claimed to have ridden for the Express at age 15, though historians debate the accuracy of that tale. Regardless, the reality was already dramatic enough. Riders had to navigate the Rocky Mountains, cross the Great Basin Desert, and brave territories where the slightest mistake could mean freezing, drowning, or vanishing without a trace. And yet the service maintained an astonishing reliability rate, even in the harshest conditions. Only one mochila was ever lost. Despite the danger, many riders loved the job. They were paid well for the time, $100 to $150 per month, a small fortune for a teenager. And they relished the thrill, the speed, and the sense of purpose. They weren't just riding mail, they were stitching the country together. The riders of the Pony Express were more than messengers. They were symbols of American courage, endurance, and tenacity, galloping through myth and memory with every hoofbeat. And for 18 unforgettable months, they proved that no frontier was too wide to cross. Riding for the Pony Express wasn't just a job, it was a daily gamble with death. The riders faced a gauntlet of perils that would have made most grown men turn back. And yet these mostly teenage boys pressed forward through nature's wrath, armed enemies, in a land that often seemed determined to swallow them whole. One of the most persistent threats came from the environment itself. Riders braved blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, blistering heat across the Nevada desert, and sudden thunderstorms that could flood river crossings or turn dirt paths into impassable muck. Slipping off a horse in freezing conditions could mean hypothermia. One wrong move in a swollen river could end in drowning. And many came dangerously close. Then there were the animals. Packs of wolves sometimes chased riders at night. Rattlesnakes coiled in trailside brush, and mountain lions stalked the high passes. But even more dangerous than wildlife were the bandits and bushwhackers who knew that a rider's mushla contained valuable letters, some even laced with gold dust or money orders. Though the riders carried revolvers, they were outnumbered, and stopping meant risking both life and mission. Tensions with Native American tribes also boiled over during the Pony Express's brief existence. The Paiute War in 1860, sparked by grievances over land, broken promises, and settler encroachment, led to several attacks on Pony Express stations. Riders were ambushed, station keepers were killed, and multiple stations were burned to the ground. The most famous episode occurred when Pony Bob Haslam galloped nearly 190 miles through hostile territory to carry the mail, suffering wounds from arrows but completing his route regardless. Even isolation was a danger. Riders were alone, often for hours, with nothing but their horse, their weapon, and the looming dark. A broken leg, an injured horse, or a missed station could mean dying alone in the wilderness, never found. And yet, they rode. Despite all this, the system endured. Mail was delayed but rarely lost. Riders were occasionally wounded, but they almost always made it through. In 18 months of operation, only a handful of men were killed on the job. The Pony Express wasn't a fantasy of the Wild West. It was a brutal, often terrifying reality. But in surviving these dangers, the riders became legends, proving that even the most unforgiving terrain could be tamed if only for long enough to deliver the mail. Though the Pony Express only operated for 18 months, its impact on the United States was swift, far-reaching, and undeniably profound. In a country teetering on the edge of civil war and desperate to feel unified across its vast landscape, the Express proved one thing loud and clear. Distance was no longer destiny before the Pony Express. It took weeks for letters to travel from the East Coast to California. Important political decisions, commercial deals, and personal news often arrived too late to matter. But with the Express, mail could reach San Francisco in just 10 days. Suddenly, Californians were no longer out of sync with the rest of the country. Businesses grew bolder. Newspapers could report near real-time updates from across the nation. Families felt closer. And most importantly, the Union felt more connected, which would become critical as the Civil War loomed. Politically, the Express also reassured the federal government that the West was within reach. It symbolized national strength and cohesion at a time when fragmentation felt dangerously close. President James Buchanan received regular updates from California during the tense months leading up to Lincoln's election, in part thanks to the Express. Economically, it helped lay the groundwork for transcontinental infrastructure. The stations built across remote territory became future sites for railroads, telegraph lines, and stagecoach routes. Many Pony Express routes would later be absorbed into more permanent communication systems. What was once a bold gamble became the blueprint for how America would connect itself coast to coast. And culturally, the Pony Express became the embodiment of frontier spirit. Newspapers romanticized the riders, creating instant heroes. Young men across the country dreamed of taking the reins, galloping through danger with a saddlebag full of destiny. The Express became mythologized even as it operated, capturing the imagination of a country hungry for symbols of courage and unity. Even after it ended, the Pony Express continued to shape American identity. It represented speed, courage, sacrifice, and above all, possibility. In just over a year, it managed to do what steamships, Congress, and diplomacy had failed to do: make a fractured, sprawling nation feel like one. The Pony Express didn't just deliver mail, it delivered the future, one gallop at a time. For all its daring and triumph, the Pony Express was doomed from the start. It wasn't a matter of failure, it was a matter of technology, as fast as a horse could ride. Nothing could compete with the speed of a wire. Just 2 days after the Pony Express officially launched in April 1860, construction began on the Transcontinental Telegraph, a coast-to-coast communication system that would transmit messages in minutes rather than days. The telegraph poles and lines advanced steadily westward from the Missouri River and eastward from California. Every mile of wire spelled another nail in the coffin of the Express. By October 24, 1861, just 18 months after the first ride, the final telegraph wire was strung across the country. The system went live and connection was instantaneous. That very same day, the Pony Express carried its last letter. The silence of hoofbeats was replaced by the rhythmic click of Morse code. But even before the telegraph, the Pony Express was bleeding money. Despite its legendary performance, it was a commercial disaster. Russell, Majors, and Waddell had poured more than $700,000 into the operation and barely recouped a fraction. With no federal subsidy and high operational costs, horses, riders, station upkeep, and supply logistics, the Express was never a sustainable business model. It was built as a proof of concept, a bold advertisement for a mail contract that never fully came through. Russell himself faced financial scandal, and the company began to collapse. By the time the telegraph was completed, the Express was already on its last legs. Heroic, beloved, but completely obsolete. Yet the end came with little bitterness. The very goal the Pony Express set out to prove, that rapid coast-to-coast communication was possible, had been achieved. Riders turned to other frontier jobs, stations were repurposed or abandoned, and the nation turned its eyes to the future. The fall of the Pony Express was not a failure. It was a passing of the torch. The horse gave way to the wire, just as the wire would later yield to radio, satellites, and the internet. But for one brief shining moment, America watched in awe as teenage boys and powerful horses conquered time and distance. In a world obsessed with speed, the Pony Express galloped into legend and left hoof prints no telegraph wire could ever erase. Though it lasted only 18 months, the Pony Express galloped straight into the mythology of the American West, becoming one of the most enduring and romanticized stories in the nation's history. In reality, it was a risky, short-lived business venture. But in the public imagination, it became something far greater, a symbol of heroism, speed, and the relentless frontier spirit Hollywood dime novels and school textbooks transformed the Express into legend. The image of a lone rider, silhouetted against the sunset, thundering across the prairie with a leather mail pouch and a six-shooter at his side, captured the nation's heart. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was national identity in motion. At a time when America was still defining itself, the Pony Express offered a story of bravery, sacrifice, and unity through hardship. Figures like Pony Bob Haslam and Buffalo Bill Cody became frontier celebrities. Cody, whether he rode for the Express or not, capitalized on the legend in his Wild West shows, cementing the image of the fearless teenage courier in the minds of millions across the world. The Express became shorthand for grit, daring, and everything Americans wanted to believe about their pioneer past. Monuments soon followed. Statues of galloping riders now stand in cities across the old trail, from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Highways and bike paths trace the original route. Reenactments, museum exhibits, and historical tours keep the memory alive. Even the U.S. Postal Service has issued Pony Express stamps honoring the brief but bold endeavor that helped unite the nation. But the story endures for a deeper reason. The Pony Express reminds us of a moment in history when human endurance raced neck and neck with nature's obstacles, when communication meant risk and connection required courage. It tells us that speed once came not from satellites, but from sheer determination and a willingness to ride through snow, desert, and darkness with nothing but a horse and a dream in our age of instant messages and global networks. It's easy to forget just how hard one communication once was. The Pony Express stands as a tribute to those who bridged impossible distances, not with fiber optics or electricity, but with muscle, grit, and a pounding heartbeat. Its legend remains not because it lasted, but because for a brief and shining moment, it outran the impossible. The earliest known beer didn't come in a frosty mug or a labeled bottle. It came in a clay pot in the middle of a Sumerian village thousands of years ago. Long before Rome rose or pyramids stood, the people of ancient Mesopotamia, specifically the Sumerians, were brewing beer in ways both simple and sacred. And they weren't just drinking it, they were worshiping it. Beer in Sumerian society wasn't just a casual beverage. It was a staple food, a form of currency, a religious offering, and a symbol of civilization. It's no accident that the oldest written recipe in human history is not for bread or soup, but for beer. Found on clay tablets dating back to around 1800 BCE, the hymn to Ninkasi praises the goddess of beer, while simultaneously laying out brewing instructions in verse. Ninkasi wasn't a minor deity. She was revered for brewing beer. was to invoke her presence. The brewing process was both practical and poetic. Sumerians would bake a special bread called vapor, made of barley and often mixed with honey or dates. This bread was then crumbled into jars of water and left to ferment naturally. The result wasn't anything like modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol, more like a nutritious gruel, and it was essential to daily life. Water in the ancient world was often contaminated, but beer, thanks to its fermentation process, was safer. It was rich in calories and nutrients, and it became a vital part of the diet for laborers, priests, and royalty alike. Workers on temple projects or irrigation ditches were frequently paid in beer rations, which could amount to several liters a day. Socially, beer was a communal experience. Rather than drinking from mugs, people often gathered around large ceramic vessels and drank through long reed straws, filtering out the sediment. It wasn't just about getting drunk, it was about bonding, surviving, and even honoring the gods. In many ways, beer helped define what it meant to be Sumerian. It was embedded in rituals, law codes, agriculture, and economics. It was a liquid civilization, both a daily necessity and a sacred act, and it set the stage for brewing cultures across the ancient world, from the banks of the Tigris to the shores of the Nile. If the Sumerians gave beer its spiritual beginning, the Egyptians industrialized it. By the time the Old Kingdom was rising along the Nile, beer had become more than a sacred drink. It was a pillar of Egyptian society, woven into everything from daily meals to divine offerings and funeral rites. Egyptian beer was brewed on a scale that dwarfed earlier methods. At large temples and palace complexes, massive breweries operated as part of the state economy. In fact, beer production was often overseen by religious institutions. The Egyptians believed beer was a gift from Osiris, god of agriculture and fertility, and it featured prominently in ceremonies honoring deities such as Hathor, the goddess of music, fertility, and joy. Frequently associated with intoxication and revelry, the brewing process was similar to that of the Sumerians, but it evolved in both technique and scale. Bread made from emmer wheat or barley was partially baked, crumbled into large vats, and mixed with water. Dates or honey were added for sweetness, and the mixture was left to ferment in ceramic jars. The resulting beverage was thick, unfiltered, and highly nutritious. Sometimes consumed with a spoon rather than sipped, beer wasn't just for the living. Tombs were stocked with jars of beer for the afterlife, alongside loaves of bread and meat. Beer was considered so essential that no respectable journey to the next world could be imagined without it. Recipes for the dead, lists of beer offerings to the gods, and murals showing the brewing process all highlight its spiritual weight. But beer also fueled the labor economy workers. Leaders who built the pyramids weren't slaves. They were paid laborers, and part of their daily rations included beer, sometimes up to 4 liters a day. This wasn't an indulgence. It was hydration, nutrition, and morale all in one. One archaeologist even called it the ancient Egyptian energy drink. The state maintained strict control over production and distribution. Taxes were levied on beer, and its quality was regulated. Women, especially priestesses and temple workers, were often involved in brewing, reinforcing its connection to both domestic life and sacred power. In short, beer in Egypt wasn't a side note. It was central. It nourished the people, pleased the gods, and filled the tombs. And like the Nile itself, it flowed through every part of Egyptian life. Across ancient civilizations, beer wasn't just a drink. It was divine communion. Its frothy presence was invited into temples, funerals, and festivals. Fermentation was not seen as a chemical process, but as a mystical transformation, a gift from the gods that turned simple grain into sacred liquid. To brew beer was to interact with the spiritual world, and to drink it was to partake in something more than sustenance. In Sumer, the goddess Ninkasi embodied this connection. Her hymn was both prayer and instruction, an act of devotion and a manual for sacred brewing. Rituals likely began with a chance to invoke her presence before fermenting began. It's possible that the final beer was shared as part of temple offerings, given to priests, and even poured out in libation to the gods themselves. In Egypt, the spiritual use of beer was woven even deeper into the religious fabric. Temples brewed their own beer for daily offerings, sometimes dedicating hundreds of jars at once. During the annual festival of drunkenness, worshippers celebrated the myth of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of destruction, who was tricked into drinking beer dyed red to resemble blood. The result? Her bloodlust was sedated and humanity was saved. It's a powerful tale of how beer was literally seen as a force that could tame divine wrath. Priests and priestesses played active roles in the brewing process, and many religious texts mention specific ritual brews intended for ceremonies. The presence of beer in funerary rites was also key. It was believed to sustain the soul on its journey to the afterlife. Some tomb inscriptions even list precise beer offerings alongside prayers and hymns. Outside the temples, seasonal festivals often involved large-scale communal drinking. These were not casual parties. They were acts of connection between the human and divine realms. Whether celebrating a harvest, honoring the dead, or marking a solstice, beer helped blur the line between the mundane and the mystical. Even in later cultures, like the Hebrews or the Hittites, beer retained spiritual undertones. While wine gained favor in elite rituals, beer remained tied to fertility, the earth, and the working class, maintaining its ancient role as a sacred and grounding force. In the ancient world, drinking beer wasn't just about thirst. It was about aligning yourself with cosmic rhythms, with gods, nature, and the cycle of life and death. Beer wasn't just a product of civilization, it may have been a cause of it. Some historians and archaeologists now argue that the desire to brew beer was one of the driving forces behind early agriculture and settlement, while grain was certainly grown for bread. The possibility that humans began cultivating cereals in part to make beer is gaining increasing scholarly support. If true, beer isn't just a byproduct of civilization, it's one of its founding pillars. In ancient Mesopotamia, where organized farming first took root, evidence suggests that barley, one of the earliest domesticated grains, was prized not just for food, but for its fermentable sugars once harvested. Barley could be stored, ground, and used in both bread and beer production, and unlike water, which was often polluted, fermented beer was safe to drink and could be stored longer. This made it essential for early communities, especially in arid or semi-arid regions, where water supplies were unreliable. Beer production also necessitated a level of social organization. Brewing required tools, storage vessels, and controlled temperatures, and precise timing. This encouraged division of labor, technological innovation, and even early science. Clay tablets show that ancient brewers understood fermentation processes well enough to replicate them consistently. No small feat in an age without thermometers or yeast packets. In urban centers like Uruk and Babylon, breweries became part of state and temple economies. Rations of beer were distributed to workers, soldiers, and bureaucrats. Taxes could be levied on grain or beer, and because beer was tied to both the economy and religion, its production was closely monitored and regulated. This meant that brewing contributed to the rise of bureaucracy, record-keeping, and standardized weights and measures. Beer was also instrumental in the growth of trade networks. Regions with surplus grain and brewing knowledge exchanged beer, ingredients, and brewing tools with neighboring cultures. Pottery jars filled with fermented beverages have been found in Levantine and Egyptian trade sites, suggesting beer was a commodity worth transporting. In short, beer helped humans settle, organize, and thrive. It fueled workers, connected cities, supported rituals, and justified grain cultivation. The frothy beverage was far more than a treat. It was liquid infrastructure, building the foundation of the ancient world, sip by sip. Long before breweries were industrialized or recipes were written down, beer was the domain of women. In many ancient cultures, brewing was not a male-dominated profession, but a household art practiced almost exclusively by females. And far from being a humble kitchen chore, brewing was seen as a sacred and skilled craft passed from mother to daughter like an heirloom recipe. In Sumerian society, beer was so entwined with femininity that even the goddess of brewing, Ninkasi, was female. This wasn't symbolic. It reflected the reality that Sumerian women were the principal brewers in both domestic and temple contexts. Brewing and baking were often done side by side, and in the early days both involved fermentation. While men oversaw politics and trade, women made the food and drink that sustained the household and society. In Egypt, women continued to dominate brewing, especially in the home. Beer was brewed in clay vessels using lightly baked loaves of grain, water, and flavorings. The process was labor-intensive but routine. Many women brewed daily or weekly, not just for family consumption, but for sale or trade in local markets. In wealthier households, Female servants or workers managed small-scale breweries. Tomb paintings and hieroglyphs often depict women brewing, straining, and storing beer, highlighting their central role in this key part of life. Women were also heavily involved in brewing for temples and rituals. Priestesses and temple workers often oversaw sacred batches meant for offerings or religious festivals. In some regions, being a brewer was a source of social status and spiritual influence. These women weren't just cooks, they were custodians of divine tradition. Over time, as societies grew more stratified and beer became commercialized, men began to dominate public brewing. But in the earliest chapters of beer's history, women held the reins. They developed the methods, managed the ingredients, and safeguarded the knowledge. Interestingly, echoes of this tradition survived into the medieval period. In Europe, many early brewers were alewives, women who made and sold ale from their homes. Some wore tall hats to be seen in the marketplace, a detail that would later be twisted into the stereotypical image of a witch. But in the ancient world, a woman with a brew pot wasn't suspicious. She was respected. She nourished gods and mortals alike, one bubbling jar at a time. Ancient brewing wasn't just luck and magic. It was a craft refined over generations, blending observation, experimentation, and environmental know-how. While each culture had its own variations, the core principles of brewing were surprisingly consistent: grain, water, fermentation, and time. But the specifics? That's where it gets fascinating. The primary grain used across much of the ancient world was barley, though emmer wheat was also common, especially in Egypt. These grains were chosen not only for their availability, but because they naturally contain the sugars and enzymes necessary for fermentation. Grains were usually partially malted, soaked in water, and allowed to germinate slightly, then either ground into mash or baked into loaves of bread, specifically intended for brewing. In both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions, these bread loaves, often called vapor and sumer, were crumbled into large ceramic vats filled with water. The mixture was stirred, sometimes boiled, and then left to ferment. Natural yeast from the air, or from the vessels themselves, triggered the fermentation process. No one knew what yeast was, but they knew it worked, and that certain vessels made better beer, likely because they housed residual yeast colonies. To sweeten or flavor the beer, brewers added dates, honey, herbs, or spices. Egyptian beer in particular was often thick and sweet, almost like a liquid porridge. Filtering was optional. Some versions were consumed with straws to avoid sediment. Others were so nutritious that beer was considered a meal in itself, especially for laborers and the poor. Temperature played a key role. In hot climates like Egypt and Mesopotamia, brewers timed their work carefully and used cool storage pits or shaded courtyards to control the environment. In some cases, beer was aged in sealed clay jars, while in others it was meant to be consumed fresh. Brewing tools included large clay vessels, wooden paddles, woven sieves, and sometimes stone hearths for heating. Everything was made by hand, and every batch was slightly different. But the knowledge was passed down orally or ritually, preserved through repetition, song, and prayer, like the hymn to Ninkasi, far from primitive. Ancient brewing techniques were sophisticated adaptations to local climates, grains, and cultural preferences. They reflect not just culinary skill, but an intimate relationship with nature, time, and transformation. A kind of alchemy where grain and water became a sacred social elixir. As beer became central to daily life, its role expanded far beyond the household or temple. In many ancient civilizations, beer was not just a beverage, it was currency, commodity, and economic engine. From workers' wages to state taxes, beer was woven directly into the fabric of ancient commerce. In Mesopotamia, beer was a key component of the ration system. Workers, including builders, farmers, and even scribes, received daily portions of beer as part of their standard pay. The amount and quality varied by rank. Higher officials received more refined beer, while laborers got thicker, coarser varieties. Detailed cuneiform tablets list these allocations, and thousands of ancient receipts show beer transactions, proof that it was as important as silver or grain in the economic ecosystem. Beer production itself became a professional trade. Breweries, often attached to temples or estates, required a small army of laborers, grain collectors, millers, bakers. fermenters and transporters. Some regions specialized in beer production, creating regional styles and establishing localized trade routes. These beers weren't bottled and shipped as today, but they could be moved in ceramic jars sealed with wax or cloth. Traders bartered beer for other goods like wool, pottery, and olive oil. In Egypt, the picture was similar. Beer was produced on an enormous scale in both urban centers and rural estates. Breweries were often attached to state granaries, and their output supported workers, soldiers, and temple activities. Beer was taxed, tracked, and stockpiled like any strategic resource. In hard times, beer even became a bartering tool in place of scarce currency. Beer also played a role in long-distance trade. Clay vessels with residues of barley-based brews have been found as far apart as the Levant, Cyprus, and Nubia, suggesting that fermented beverages were exchanged alongside luxury items. While wine would eventually dominate elite markets, beer remained a people's drink, embedded in every transaction from village markets to temple distributions. Its portability and perishability made beer a uniquely local economic product, but one with national importance. Its production supported farmers, artisans, merchants, and priests alike. It was both daily sustenance and state infrastructure. In short, ancient beer wasn't just consumed, it was counted, traded, stored, and spent. It helped build pyramids, fund temples, and sustain empires. A mug of beer may have cost a few copper coins, but behind it stood a microcosm of civilization. In the ancient world, beer was the great equalizer. Everyone drank it, but not everyone drank the same kind. Just as with food, clothing, and language, beer reflected and reinforced the rigid social hierarchies of the time. While commoners sipped thick, hearty brews for survival, the elites turned beer into a status symbol, a ritual offering, and sometimes even a political tool. Among the Sumerians and Akkadians, workers were issued daily beer rations. Their brews were dark, unfiltered, and dense, more stew than drink, but incredibly nourishing. These were functional beers meant to sustain laborers in hot, arid conditions. Yet even here there was variation. Some tablets mention at least 9 distinct types of beer, ranked by quality and purpose. The better versions were often reserved for scribes, priests, or administrators, showing that beer was already being used to draw class lines in Egypt. The contrast was even starker. While everyday Egyptians drank a thick beer made from emmer wheat and flavored with dates, the wealthy enjoyed refined brews, lighter, sweeter, and sometimes filtered. Tomb paintings depict nobles with goblets of golden beer, seated under palm fronds, while servants poured from elegant jars. For the upper classes, beer was not just sustenance, it was an aesthetic experience. Pharaohs and their families received beer offerings daily, often alongside wine and bread. These libations weren't mere tradition. They reflected power. Only the rich could afford dedicated brewing staff, access to the finest ingredients, and the leisure to enjoy beer recreationally, rather than depend on it for calories. Beer also served diplomatic and ceremonial functions during feasts, treaties, or religious festivals. Offering beer of high quality signaled wealth and respect. Not offering beer that could be seen as an insult. Interestingly, the brewing profession itself mirrored this divide. In homes and villages, women or slaves typically brewed the family's supply. But in temples or elite households, professional brewers, sometimes trained and salaried, handled production. The beer that flowed from temple vats was better regulated, better taxed, and more politically significant. So while beer was universal, its taste, texture, and meaning varied wildly depending on who you were. For some, it was daily fuel. For others, it was an expression of divinity, wealth, and refinement. In every jar, ancient beer carried not just flavor, but a quiet signature of social status, foaming at the rim. Though thousands of years have passed since Sumerian priestesses chanted to Ninkasi or Egyptian workers sipped beer beneath pyramid shadows, the legacy of ancient brewing still lives on in our recipes, rituals, economies, and cultural memory. Beer, perhaps more than any other beverage, connects us to the earliest expressions of civilization. Modern brewing owes a great debt to the ancient world. Many techniques we take for granted today. Malting grain, fermenting with wild yeast, flavoring with herbs or fruit, were pioneered by brewers with no microscopes or thermometers. Instead, they relied on intuition, tradition, and trial and error, guided by oral wisdom and spiritual reverence. These methods formed the foundation of what would eventually become scientific brewing in later eras. The ancient attitude toward beer also lingers in cultural traditions. In places like Ethiopia, Peru, and rural Eastern Europe, communities still brew beer in ceramic vessels, often using age-old recipes passed down through families, echoes of Sumerian and Egyptian kitchens. In these places, brewing is not just a hobby or business. It's a ritual of community, just as it was 5,000 years ago. The symbolic power of beer has also endured. Festivals, holidays, and social gatherings around the world still feature beer as a central offering, a drink of celebration, bonding, and identity. Even the communal pint of the pub carries the same spirit as the ancient Sumerian clay pot shared by reed straws. Beer as a bridge between people. Academically, the study of ancient brewing has sparked a growing field known as bioarchaeology. Using residue analysis, scientists have reconstructed ancient beer recipes, brewed them, and even sold them commercially. Experimental archaeology projects have successfully brewed beer from ancient Egyptian tomb recipes, offering modern people a literal taste of history. Perhaps most importantly, ancient beer reminds us that civilization wasn't just built on conquest, stone, or steel. It was also built in kitchens and breweries by ordinary people who turned grain and water into sustenance, economy, and culture. It was made by women, consumed by workers, and offered to gods. So the next time you raise a glass, remember you're not just drinking a beverage. You're participating in one of humanity's oldest and most universal rituals, a legacy brewed over millennia and still fermenting in every corner of the world. Medieval intimacy did not unfold beneath silk sheets and candlelit chambers, while a lute played softly in the background. In reality, the setting was usually a small single-room home shared by an entire family, including children, aging relatives, a couple of goats, and a chicken who had strong opinions about personal space. Privacy, as we think of it, simply didn't exist. Most peasants lived in homes where the kitchen, bedroom, and stable were technically the same square footage, just with different smells. If a couple wanted some alone time, they had to get creative. Timing mattered. So did volume. And ideally, so did whether the kids were asleep and facing the wall. Curtains were a luxury. Beds were shared, and even among the upper classes, servants might be asleep at the foot of the bed or standing in the corner, pretending not to notice anything. Many noble households kept records of bedroom arrangements for legal or religious reasons, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds. Traveling also didn't help. Inns often had shared beds. That's right, total strangers might sleep side by side for the night, which made things even more complicated. Want a little affection? You better check if there's already someone in the bed and whether or not they brought their boots. If you were married and both parties were still awake and reasonably clean, you could share a mattress of straw and hope for the best if you weren't married. Well, you had to be twice as quiet and 3 times as careful. Communities were small, walls were thin, and gossip traveled faster than plague rats. For those living in monasteries or convents, the rule was simple. No privacy, no distractions, and certainly no late-night whispers. But even there, human nature occasionally made things complicated, which explains why many abbeys had unusually high garden walls in the medieval world. Few things shaped private life more than the church, and it had a lot to say about what went on behind closed doors, or more accurately, behind shared curtains. According to church teachings, physical intimacy had one primary function: making more people. That was it. Not pleasure, not bonding, not stress relief, just reproduction. Everything else? Distracting at best, sinful at worst. This wasn't just Sunday sermon material. Bishops, theologians, and confessors wrote detailed instructions on what was and wasn't acceptable in case anyone dared to improvise. Certain days of the week were off limits. So were major feast days, fasting days, holy days, and in some regions, entire liturgical seasons. Want to be close to your spouse during Lent? Think again. Advent. Also no. That left maybe. Tuesdays in April. Even within marriage, there were expectations. Couples were encouraged to approach one another with modesty and restraint. Expressions of affection were acceptable, but not excessive. Displays of passion were, to put it mildly, frowned upon. The 113th Century Guide suggested that married couples should engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, which is by all accounts a fairly joyless checklist. The preferred method was missionary, and not just for religious symbolism. It was deemed the most natural, and therefore the least likely to offend God, the saints, or your local priest. Anything else was considered suspect. That includes things like enthusiasm. Confession also got involved. Priests often asked pointed questions during confession to determine whether couples had broken any moral or ecclesiastical guidelines. These weren't vague spiritual inquiries. They were very specific, sometimes uncomfortably so. Let's just say the average 14th century friar knew far more about his parishioners' bedrooms than their birthdays. Still, enforcement was uneven. Some regions were stricter than others. Some priests ignored these rules entirely, and many lay people, particularly peasants, simply smiled, nodded, and did what they were going to do anyway. Quietly, if you think modern couples have trouble syncing their schedules, spare a thought for medieval folks. Planning a romantic evening in the Middle Ages required a calendar, a priest's blessing, and the luck of Saint Valentine himself, who, ironically, was never married. The church had opinions, and by opinions we mean strict prohibitions on when intimacy was allowed. Sundays? Absolutely not. That was the Lord's Day. Fridays still have no day of penance. Wednesdays are suspicious. Add in Lent 40 days, Advent another 40. Various saints' feast days, holy days, fast days, and even certain moon phases. And you'll find the calendar was less of a schedule and more of a divine obstacle course. The idea was to keep the soul focused on heaven, even when the body had other ideas. There were even actual lists, of forbidden days. Some confession manuals outlined nearly half the year as off-limits. And if you were feeling particularly affectionate during one of those forbidden days, well, enjoy your spiritual guilt and an extra trip to confession. One 13th century bishop scolded a married couple for their excessive affection, which translated to more than once a month. He recommended they direct their passion toward prayer. The couple was reportedly not thrilled. Naturally, the upper classes were more exposed to these restrictions. They had chaplains, confessors, and spiritual advisors breathing down their necks. Peasants, meanwhile, had a more flexible approach. Their lives revolved around livestock, weather, and not freezing to death, which left less time for worrying about whether Tuesday was the feast of St. No fun. To make things worse, some believed that intimacy during the wrong time could result in sickly children. Divine punishment, or worst of all, a reputation. If your neighbors caught wind that you were celebrating a little too enthusiastically during Lent, it could lead to shame, gossip, or a strongly worded sermon delivered with maximum eye contact. Romance in medieval Europe was less about falling in love and more about falling into a legally binding agreement. If you were hoping for candlelit dinners, poetry, and whispered confessions, you'd be better off reading a troubadour ballad. Real-life courtship for most people involved livestock, land rights, and two families agreeing not to start a feud. Marriage was primarily a business deal. Daughters were exchanged to cement alliances, acquire property, or secure peace between neighbors who had previously disagreed over whose pig ate whose cabbage. A bride might come with a dowry of coin, linens, or a small patch of farmland in return. The groom's family might promise not to be entirely insufferable. Courtship, when it happened, was supervised, sometimes literally. Young people rarely courted alone. A maiden might be watched over by her mother, a stern aunt, or if things got really serious, an entire village that was very invested in whether or not you held hands. Among the nobility, arranged matches were the norm. Kings and lords negotiated marriages like chess moves, and affection was something you developed later, or not at all. As one medieval proverb more or less stated, better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples. Romantic. Even among peasants, practical concerns ruled. A man's suitability was judged by his land, tools, or the size of his ox and women. They were evaluated on their housekeeping skills, reputation, and general ability to not start drama at the market. This doesn't mean love didn't exist. It did, but it usually came after marriage, not before. If affection grew over time, that was considered a bonus, not a requirement. Think of it like medieval emotional DLC, not included in the base marriage package. Still, where there's a will, there's a workaround. Secret flirtations, playful songs, and moonlit walks to the village well became the unsanctioned side quests of medieval dating. Just be careful. Get caught kissing behind a barn, and you could face public penance, a fine, or a very disappointed father with a pitchfork. Let's clear up one of the most persistent legends about medieval relationships, chastity belts. Yes, you've probably seen them in cartoons, historical dramas, or very unfortunate museum gift shops. Those iron contraptions allegedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war, leaving her physically and morally sealed. Except not really. There's no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. In fact, most examples we have today come from the Renaissance or even the Victorian era, periods more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with what actually happened. Many of these belts were created as joke items, warnings, or museum curiosities, not functioning devices. Medieval manuscripts, which often record all sorts of uncomfortable details, are suspiciously silent about mass belt distribution. No tailors advertised them. No laws regulated them. No churches handed them out during awkward marriage ceremonies. It's almost as if, and stay with me here, they weren't actually a thing. Which makes sense, because the design is wildly impractical. Medieval hygiene was already questionable. Now imagine adding a rusty metal contraption with no user manual and a padlock that probably required a blacksmith. It would have caused more infections than it prevented indiscretions. So where did the myth come from? Likely from a combination of later moral panic and satire. Renaissance moralists and Victorian collectors loved the image of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It fits their narrative. And nothing says virtue like a literal keyhole in your underpants. In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional and more effective means. Shame, surveillance, religion, and strategic matchmaking. Noble women were often chaperoned within an inch of their lives. Peasant girls had entire villages watching them like unpaid private investigators, and any whiff of scandal could lead to ruined reputations, lost dowries, or awkward confessions involving phrases like "at the edge of the barley field." In a surprising twist that would shock many of their modern descendants, medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels. In many cases, they regulated them. That's right, in several parts of medieval Europe, especially urban centers, brothels operated as legal businesses. Town councils licensed them, charged taxes, and even designated specific red light districts long before the light bulb was invented. Some cities went as far as employing officials to manage them. These lucky souls were known as brothel keepers, or more colorfully, keepers of public women, which sounds like a very stressful line on a resume. The rationale behind this arrangement was pragmatic, if a little cynical. Officials believed that allowing a controlled outlet for men's desires would reduce the chances of greater sins, like adultery, assault, or, heaven forbid, dancing. Regulated brothels were seen as a necessary evil to keep society orderly, much like traffic signs or the existence of turnips. The church, of course, wasn't thrilled. Officially, it condemned the entire practice. But unofficially, many clergy turned a blind eye. Some even collected rent from the very same establishments. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations. You've grasped the essence of medieval theology and practice. Working in a brothel was no fairy tale, but it wasn't necessarily a life of constant misery either. Some women chose the profession for economic reasons, especially widows or those without family support. Others were coerced or trafficked, particularly in port cities, where sailors brought in coins and complications in equal measure. There were even handbooks. Yes, actual handbooks for how these houses should be managed. Clean sheets, basic health inspections, and set hours were all part of the regulation process. Patrons came from all social classes: knights, apprentices, merchants, even monks, despite vows that strongly suggested otherwise. Entry fees varied. Services were cataloged, and in some cases customers paid in eggs, wool, or whatever awkward barter they had on hand. Medieval Tinder. It was not. Let's set the scene. Candlelight flickering, a soft breeze through the thatched roof. Your beloved whispers sweet nothings, and then removes their wool tunic to reveal a powerful medieval musk. Because when it came to personal hygiene, medieval Europe had priorities. Staying clean was on the list just somewhere after surviving the plague, fixing the roof, and catching the pig that got into the pantry again. Bathing did happen, but not nearly as often as modern noses would hope. Peasants bathed infrequently, maybe once a month, more if they fell into a river by accident. Soap was either homemade or imported, expensive and used sparingly. And while public bathhouses existed in towns and cities, they were sometimes banned during outbreaks of disease or scandal, or both. If you were wealthy, you had options. A hot bath could be drawn, scented with herbs, and followed by being rubbed with linen cloths by attendants. If you were poor, your sponge bath involved a cold bucket and the vague hope that nobody would notice your aroma over the stables. To add complexity, water itself was occasionally viewed with suspicion, especially cold water. Some believed bathing too frequently could weaken the body or open the skin to illness. Others simply didn't have the time or the tub or any water that wasn't already being fought over by the local geese. Now imagine trying to impress someone under these conditions. Perfume, mostly for the elite. Deodorant, a dream of the distant future. Dental care. Well, you might rub your teeth with ash or chew mint leaves if you were fancy. Kissing was certainly an adventure. Clothing didn't help. Layers of wool, leather, linen, and fur trapped heat, sweat, and every scent you encounter during your day, including the contents of the chamber pot and the mystery stew. And yet people still found ways to fall in love, flirt, and get close. Perhaps our standards were different. Or perhaps when everyone smelled equally awful, love was truly blind and nose blind. In medieval Europe, controlling the size of your family was a bit like trying to steer a cart with no wheels, no reins, and a particularly uncooperative goat. Technically possible, but not something you could count on. To be clear, people did try. Just because contraception wasn't effective by modern standards didn't mean medieval folks were oblivious. They were very much aware that certain behaviors led to babies, and many went to elaborate, if occasionally baffling, lengths to prevent it. So the more scientific methods included herbal mixtures, animal membranes, and rituals that involved burying certain objects near the doorstep. One popular approach advised drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles. Others recommended wearing amulets blessed by someone who hopefully wasn't guessing. A few guides even claimed jumping up and down vigorously after intimacy would help, which, if nothing else, probably burns some calories. There were also early versions of barrier methods, though calling them reliable would be generous. Linen soaked in various concoctions was one approach. A few brave souls tried wax, and there are scattered references to, let's call them medieval prototypes of what would later become familiar latex devices. But don't ask how they were made. You really don't want to know. The church, of course, was not amused. Any attempt to avoid conception was often labeled sinful or unnatural. Procreation was the stated goal of marriage, and anything that got in the way of that divine mission was frowned upon, or more commonly, denounced loudly from the pulpit still. Not everyone followed church guidance. Among married couples, particularly those struggling with poverty, the desire to space out pregnancies or avoid another mouth to feed was very real. And among unmarried couples, let's just say the motivation was even stronger. But no matter the method, reliability was low. Birth control, such as it was, depended on folk wisdom, local herbs, and a surprising amount of hope. And when it failed, which it often did, well, that's where hasty marriages, hidden pregnancies, and a lot of awkward conversations came in. Despite what church authorities like to pretend, not every medieval couple waited until the wedding bells rang before getting cozy. In fact, the practice of testing the goods before marriage was, well, common enough to require a lot of paperwork, known as fornication in church records and getting ahead of yourself in everyday village gossip. Intimacy before marriage wasn't exactly rare, but was definitely monitored. In towns and parishes across Europe, local officials kept moral rolls which were less like diaries and more like ledgers of shame. If a couple was caught or even suspected of jumping the marital timeline, they could be hauled before the local court and fined. Sometimes the fine went to the church, sometimes to the town, and occasionally to someone who claimed to have witnessed the event. Medieval snitching was alive and well. Fines varied depending on whether it was a first offense, whether a pregnancy resulted, or whether the couple eventually got married. In some cases, getting married after the fact erased the fine, kind of like retroactive permission. In others, the fine was still applied, but at a discounted rate. Early bird penalties, if you will. And let's not forget the social consequences. In tight-knit communities, everyone knew everyone else's business. So even if your local priest was feeling merciful, your neighbors weren't. Gossip could spread faster than a poorly stored meat pie in July. Interestingly, many of these situations resulted in something called hand fasting, a sort of informal engagement where the couple consider themselves betrothed, and in some regions, that was legally enough to begin cohabiting. The church later tried to tighten that loophole, but in the meantime, a lot of medieval babies were technically early arrivals. Among peasants, this was all handled with a bit more practicality. If a couple was clearly serious and a pregnancy had occurred, marriage usually followed, sometimes hurried along with a gentle nudge or firm push from both families. Among nobles, however, consequences could be far worse, especially if inheritance or reputation was on the line. In the medieval world, virginity wasn't just a virtue. It was a contract clause, a political tool, and occasionally a community-wide obsession. Among the peasantry, expectations varied by region and circumstance. A young woman was generally expected to arrive at marriage untested, at least officially. But if she didn't, well, some eyebrows would rise, and a small fine or shotgun wedding might sort things out. For the upper classes, though, things got serious. Noble women's virginity was directly tied to inheritance, alliances, and family honor. A broken engagement might spark a feud. A pregnancy out of wedlock could derail generations of planning. So, how did they verify it? Well, badly. Sometimes it came down to vague testimony and character references. She seemed virtuous, or she avoided the stable boy mostly. Other times, more invasive methods were used, like midwives or matrons inspecting for the infamous hymen, which science has since confirmed is not in fact a medieval chastity barometer. But that didn't stop anyone. There were also attempts to prove virginity after the wedding, such as displaying a blood-stained sheet, like a very awkward medieval Yelp review. This tradition, while not universal, was expected in certain regions, and if the sheet stayed clean. Cue lawsuits, annulments, and family drama on a scale rivaling a royal soap opera. Men, of course, were under no such scrutiny. Male virginity was considered an optional bonus. A future husband's experience level was rarely questioned. At most, he might be encouraged to avoid tavern maids or loose company, but no one was checking his laundry the next morning. Virginity was also linked to religious symbolism. Maidens were often praised as pure vessels, which is beautiful in theory and incredibly uncomfortable in practice. Young girls were raised with saintly ideals, often featuring horrifying martyrdom stories. And if a marriage was annulled on the grounds that a bride had been dishonest, it didn't just ruin her. It could drag down her entire family's honor and property claims. So yes, in medieval Europe, virginity wasn't just about morality. It was legal currency. If you're wondering whether same-sex attraction existed in medieval times, the answer is a resounding yes. Human nature didn't start in the 20th century, but if you're wondering whether it was openly accepted, that's where things get complicated. Medieval society was structured around religious doctrine, social roles, and property rights, and all three had a lot to say about who could love whom. Spoiler alert, it was usually a man and a woman within marriage, preferably for the purpose of making more villages. Officially, same-sex intimacy was labeled a sin by the church, often lumped in with other unnatural acts, like dancing on feast days or reading too many books. Punishments varied wildly depending on region, time period, and who was involved. A peasant couple might get a scolding and penance. Nobles, they might face exile, or quietly be ignored if they had enough land. But while the church thundered from the pulpit, real life was messier. We have records, poems, letters, even legal documents that show emotional, romantic, and sometimes physical relationships between people of the same sex. Some monks wrote love letters to each other in Latin that sound suspiciously less brotherly and more longing. Noble women sometimes shared beds and declared exclusive devotion in terms that would make a troubadour blush. Medieval Europe also had social structures that blurred lines. All-male monasteries and all-female convents created deep emotional bonds. Knightly brotherhoods were full of vows and affectionate language. Some historians debate whether these were romantic, platonic, or something in between, but either way, there were feelings involved, and possibly poetry. As for terminology, the modern concept of sexual identity didn't exist. You didn't come out. You just lived carefully, quietly, and often coded in allegory. There were no pride parades, but there were songs, saint stories, and suspiciously intense pilgrimages taken in pairs. Adultery in medieval Europe was a bit like handling a live chicken while juggling knives. Risky, loud, and likely to end with someone losing a bit of pride or property. Let's be clear. Adultery wasn't just a personal failing. It was a social offense. Marriage was seen not only as a holy sacrament, but also a legal contract, a property deal, and often a strategic alliance. So when someone strayed, they weren't just breaking hearts. They were tampering with inheritances, dowries, and the always fragile local gossip equilibrium. For women, the stakes were significantly higher. A married woman caught in an affair could face public shaming, loss of dowry rights, forced penance, or even exile, especially if she had the audacity to get caught with evidence. Adulterous noblewomen might find themselves imprisoned, divorced, or in extreme cases, discreetly removed from court life. Think less scarlet letter, more scarlet exit. Men, on the other hand, got more leeway. A married man having an affair with an unmarried woman might be seen as morally suspect but not legally punished, unless the woman's family had powerful friends or the church was feeling unusually righteous that week. That said, not all adulterers got off easy. Some towns imposed steep fines or required public confession. A few legal records include creative punishments, such as parading through the village in nothing but shift, or having to pay for a new church bell, because nothing says divine justice like bronze acoustics. The real danger, however, wasn't always the law. It was the husband. Honor killings weren't unheard of, particularly among nobles. If a cuckolded man discovered his wife's affair, medieval custom sometimes allowed him to take appropriate action. The definition of appropriate, of course, depended heavily on his status and how many swords he owned. For the wealthy, things could spiral into full-blown scandals, duels, annulments, or decade-long family feuds. For peasants, the consequences were usually financial. A fine here, a goat forfeited there, and a permanent place in village gossip. In medieval Europe, the idea of consent existed, but not in the way we understand it today. It wasn't about mutual respect or enthusiastic yes. Instead, it was tangled in law codes, dowries, church doctrine, and the occasional shrug from society. Let's start with the basics. Medieval canon law did recognize the concept of consent in marriage. In fact, a marriage was considered valid if both parties verbally consented, even without a priest present. That's right, two people saying "I will" in a field somewhere could technically be married. Romantic, possibly. Legally confusing. Absolutely. But here's the rub. Just because consent was acknowledged in theory doesn't mean it was respected in practice, especially for women. For noble daughters, consent often came after arrangements were made. Families negotiated marriages like peace treaties. The young lady's opinion might be politely requested or strongly implied. But in the end, the dowry talked louder than she did. For peasant women, choices were broader, but still pressured. Saying no to a match could mean economic ruin or social backlash. Saying no to the local Reeves' son, riskier still. Inside marriage, consent became even murkier. Husbands had legal rights to their wives' bodies, and denying them could be grounds for complaint or annulment. Some church thinkers argued that spouses owed each other. The marital debt, which sounds like a joint checking account, but was actually far less voluntary. Still, the picture wasn't all grim. Medieval courts did prosecute cases of coercion and assault, especially when witnesses were available or the accused didn't have powerful friends. In urban centers like London or Paris, court records show women and men bringing forward complaints, sometimes winning justice, or at least making a public stink. And let's not forget the literary side. Medieval tales are full of complex dynamics. Courtly love poetry, for example, often danced around consent, with knights pining, ladies refusing, and everyone dramatically swooning. If nothing else, they knew it was important to ask, even if they ignored the answer. If you ever felt like the medieval church had a complicated relationship with physical pleasure, you're right. It wasn't just complicated, it was borderline suspicious. And that suspicion extended right into the bedroom of every married couple, where the church preferred, ideally, that nothing too enjoyable was going on. To be fair, the church didn't outright ban marital relations. That would have been a logistical nightmare for inheritance, population, and, well, humanity. But it did strongly recommend moderation, extreme moderation, like once a month in the dark, no smiling kind of moderation. Theologians of the time praised celibacy as the highest form of spiritual discipline. Saints were celibate. Monks and nuns took vows. Even married couples were encouraged to live in continence, abstaining entirely, especially if they were older, holier, or simply tired of each other. A couple who voluntarily gave up intimacy was praised as being halfway to sainthood, or at least halfway to separate beds. Some church thinkers like St. Jerome went even further. He argued that even within marriage, desire was a weakness. Marital relations were acceptable only for procreation, not for fun, not for bonding, and certainly not because someone looked particularly fetching in their woolen nightshirt. This attitude filtered down into confessionals and moral manuals. Priests were instructed to ask married parishioners if they had been too lustful, even with their own spouses. Picture the awkward silence that must have followed that question at the altar rail. And yet people still live their lives. Most peasants, merchants, and even nobles nodded politely at the church's teachings, then went home and did whatever felt right between chores, taxes, and the odd peasant uprising. Let's be honest, after a long day threshing barley or settling land disputes, a little affection probably felt more comforting than shameful, but for the truly devout, celibate marriages were held up as models of spiritual partnership. These were couples who lived together, prayed together, and considered carnal urges a thing of the past, or at least a thing better left to younger, less holy villagers. After everything we've covered, arranged marriages, fines for flirting, herbal birth control, suspicious bath habits, and church warnings against smiling too much, you might be wondering, did medieval people actually fall in love? The answer is yes, awkwardly, passionately, and sometimes even happily. Despite the rigid social structures and moral sermons, love found a way to bloom in the cracks. Peasant couples quartered in fields and marketplaces, trading favors, flowers, and whispered gossip over turnips. Noble lovers exchanged poetry and secret glances during formal banquets while pretending to care about hunting falcon breeds. Monks and nuns wrote letters filled with emotion that modern readers still debate. Was it spiritual longing or something more? Literature from the period is bursting with romance. Troubadours sang of distant ladies who inspired knights to go off and get very dramatically injured. Stories of courtly love glorified longing from afar, especially if you were pining for someone married to your boss. Sure, the love was often unattainable, but hey, that's where the best verses come from. In some cases, couples genuinely married for love. Records survive of peasants who eloped or refused matches arranged by their parents. Even nobles occasionally rebelled, much to the horror of their family accountants. The church, interestingly enough, actually required verbal consent from both bride and groom, even if that consent was delivered through gritted teeth while holding a goose as dowry collateral. And once married, many couples built strong partnerships. They worked side by side, raised children, endured plagues, and navigated taxes, which is basically the medieval version of a romantic getaway letter between spouses. Especially during times of separation, show real affection, real longing, real commitment. Even widows and widowers sometimes remarried for companionship rather than political gain, choosing someone they like to spend their remaining years with. Because even after everything, the rules, the risk, the ritual, people still wanted to feel loved, preferably before curfew, and hopefully not during Lent. It all began with a disaster. Zeno of Citium, a wealthy merchant from the island of Cyprus, had it all. ships loaded with precious dyes, trade routes mapped across the Mediterranean, and the kind of fortune that made a man feel invincible. But fate, as ancient philosophers love to remind us, doesn't care how many ships you own somewhere near Athens. Zeno's fleet was caught in a violent storm. The sea didn't just swallow his cargo, it swallowed his identity. One moment he was a merchant, the next a man with nothing. When he finally reached the Athenian shore, he was broke, soaked, and, ironically, on the verge of something far more enduring than trade wealth. With nowhere to go and nothing left to lose, Zeno wandered into a small bookshop in the Athenian Agora. It was here that he picked up a worn copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, a text that preserved the wisdom of Socrates. Intrigued by the quiet power of the ideas within, Zeno asked the bookseller where he could find a man like Socrates. The bookseller simply pointed to a stooped, cranky philosopher named Crates walking by, and so Zeno began studying under Crates the Cynic. A man known for rejecting wealth and possessions with almost theatrical dedication, he once threw his money into the sea just to prove a point. At first, Zeno struggled with this extreme lifestyle. He wasn't ready to live in poverty for philosophy's sake. But Crates planted a seed in his mind, one that grew into a new way of thinking. Zeno didn't stay a student forever. Over time, he pieced together his own worldview, borrowing Socratic ethics, Cynic discipline, and the logical rigor of earlier thinkers like Heraclitus. Eventually, he began teaching in the painted colonnade of Athens, the Stoa, a public porch decorated with murals. That's where Stoicism got its name, not from an ivory tower or secret academy, but from a painted porch open to all. It's a fitting origin, a philosophy born not from luxury, but from ruin, not in a palace, but in a moment of humility. Stoicism, from its first breath, was designed to help people navigate the wreckage, not avoid it, and Zeno was its first survivor. After the shipwreck and the scrolls, after the quiet conversations with cynics, and the long walks under the Athenian sun, Zeno didn't just start teaching, he started redefining what it meant to live well. At the heart of his philosophy was one powerful idea, logos. To the Stoics, logos wasn't just reason. It was the divine, rational structure of the universe, the cosmic blueprint. Everything they believed happened for a reason, whether or not humans could understand it. The world, messy as it seemed, was ordered, and if you could align your thinking with that cosmic order, you could live with peace, clarity, and moral strength. Zeno and his early followers taught that virtue, arete in Greek, was the only true good. Not fame, not wealth, not even physical health. Those were indifferents, things that might be nice to have, but didn't define your moral worth. What mattered was how you handled them, and that's where the Stoic mindset takes shape. The world throws chaos at you, but you remain unmoved. Not emotionless, but anchored. You can't control external events. You can't control what people say or do. But you can always control your thoughts, your actions, and your responses. It was radical. Most people back then, and let's be honest, most people today chase comfort, admiration, money, or control. But Stoicism offered a quieter path. Live in harmony with nature. Accept fate without resentment. And strive only to be good, not to feel good. Their favorite analogy? Life is like being a dog tied to a cart. You can either run with it or be dragged behind. Either way, the cart's going forward. Your choice is how you move with it. Zeno wasn't alone for long. His students began gathering in the Stoa, discussing how to master themselves rather than the world over time. This porch talk turned into one of the most quietly resilient philosophies in history, and one that would outlast empires. But philosophy doesn't live in theory, it lives in practice. And in the next generation, a new Stoic would take the reins. One who fought battles not with logic alone, but with discipline and steel. His name? Cleanthes, a former boxer who brought muscle to the mind. Cleanthes wasn't your typical philosopher. Before he ever scribbled a single scroll or stood beneath the painted porch, he was a boxer. Not metaphorically a literal pugilist, earning his bread through sheer physical strength and relentless endurance. But when he discovered Zeno's teachings, he found a different kind of strength, the kind that didn't bruise but braced the soul. He worked by night, carrying water for a gardener, and studied philosophy by day. His hands were calloused, his muscles worn, but his mind is unshakable. Cleanthes embodied the Stoic belief that virtue comes not from privilege, but from perseverance. He didn't speak of theories he hadn't tested. If Zeno taught that one should accept hardship with grace, Cleanthes lived it every sunrise. His most famous work, the Hymn to Zeus, is a poetic tribute to Logos, the divine rationality that governs all things. But don't let the title fool you. This wasn't religious flattery. It was a calm declaration of cosmic order. Everything Cleanthes wrote is woven into a grand plan, even the painful parts. His stoicism was like a glacier, silent, immense, and impossible to move. He also introduced a more emotional texture to stoicism. While Zeno emphasized logic and detachment, Cleanthes suggested proper emotions, like awe at nature or love for wisdom, could have a place if they aligned with reason. He wasn't arguing for indulgence, just for balance. After all, what good is a philosophy that turns you into a robot? Cleanthes wasn't flashy, and he didn't gather crowds with clever wordplay. In fact, some mocked him for being slow of speech. But what he lacked in eloquence, he made up for in steadiness. And in Stoicism, steadiness was everything. He eventually succeeded Zeno as head of the Stoic school, not because he was charismatic, but because he lived the philosophy more fully than anyone else. His life was a kind of walking proof, a quiet testament that one could endure hardship without bitterness, question fate without rage, and remain grounded without giving up on greatness. Through Cleanthes, Stoicism gained muscle, not the kind that wins applause, but the kind that holds your spine straight when the world goes sideways. And then came a man who sharpened Stoicism like a blade. Chrysippus, the logician who turned this porch-born philosophy into a towering system of thought. If Zeno founded Stoicism and Cleanthes gave it strength, Chrysippus gave it its skeleton. Without him, Stoicism might have crumbled into vague ideas and forgotten porch lectures instead. It became one of the most rigorous philosophical systems in the ancient world, thanks to a man who reportedly wrote over 700 books, most of them now lost. But their influence, undeniable. Chrysippus was relentless. He didn't just inherit the school from Cleanthes, he rebuilt it. Where Zeno had been reserved and Cleanthes poetic, Chrysippus was surgical. His specialty? Logic. In a time when most philosophers leaned on rhetoric or emotional appeal, Chrysippus built a system of reasoning that could rival Aristotle's. He was obsessed with clarity. He believed that if Stoicism was to survive, it couldn't rely on charisma or tradition. It had to make sense. Ironclad, no loopholes, no fluff. He refined the Stoic distinction between what is in our control and what is not. He expanded their ethics, metaphysics and physics into something coherent and unapologetically difficult. Chrysippus argued that virtue alone was sufficient for happiness, not virtue plus comfort or virtue plus friends. Just virtue. Full stop. One of his most famous contributions was the lectern, a concept describing the meaning behind words. He argued that every spoken word had a sayable, a layer of content carried by speech tied to logic. It might sound abstract, but this deepened the Stoic understanding of reason and clarity, which for them was essential to a good life. But he wasn't just dry parchment and dusty scrolls. Chrysippus had a biting wit. Once, when accused of not practicing what he preached, he supposedly replied, "Would you blame a doctor who gets sick? He still knows how to treat illness." Stoicism wasn't about pretending to be perfect. It was about trying every single day to close the gap between your actions and your ideals. Thanks to Chrysippus, Stoicism hardened. It became more than a comfort for shipwrecked merchants or poetic boxers. It became a discipline, something you studied, practiced, and used to cut through confusion and chaos. And that discipline would soon find its way out of Greece, into the heart of Rome, where emperors and slaves alike would grapple with its power. By the time Stoicism drifted into Rome, the philosophy had already weathered centuries of refinement, but in the hands of the Romans. It evolved from a Greek intellectual pursuit into a way of life suited for statesmen, generals, and even emperors. The Romans weren't interested in abstract metaphysics or syllogisms about lecta. They wanted practicality. They faced wars, conspiracies, betrayal, and personal ruin, and they needed a system that could hold their inner world steady while the outer world collapsed. Stoicism, with its focus on self-mastery and virtue in the face of chaos, was a perfect fit. Enter Seneca the Younger, philosopher, playwright, and reluctant advisor to the notoriously unstable Emperor Nero. Seneca wasn't born into hardship. He was a wealthy elite, well-educated, and dangerously close to power. But despite his position, his writings reveal a man deeply aware of life's fragility and the corrupting lure of comfort. In his letters to Lucilius, Seneca preached restraint, mindfulness, and simplicity. He warned against being ruled by emotion or desire, and yet his own life was a battlefield between Stoic ideals and political compromise. He amassed wealth even as he wrote about frugality. He served a tyrant even while writing about virtue. But rather than discredit him, this tension makes him more relatable. Seneca didn't pose as a St. He was painfully aware of his contradictions. His advice to others often came with a quiet self-rebuke. "I am not a wise man," he wrote, "but a lover of wisdom." And maybe that's the most Stoic thing of all. Not to claim mastery, but to pursue it humbly. While Seneca offered Stoicism to the elite, another Roman gave it to everyone else. Epictetus, a former slave. Crippled and impoverished, Epictetus owned nothing, not even himself. And yet he taught that true freedom comes from within. "You may chain my leg," he said, "but not even Zeus can conquer my mind." To him, life's hardships weren't obstacles. They were training grounds for virtue. His teachings, preserved by his student Arrian, became a Stoic manual for inner liberation in Rome. Stoicism was no longer just philosophy. It was armor, mental armor. And soon that armor would be worn by the man who ruled the known world. Marcus Aurelius, emperor, warrior, and the most unlikely of all, philosopher king. It's one thing to read philosophy in peace. It's another to write it on the front lines of war, while ruling an empire crumbling at its edges. Marcus Aurelius, crowned emperor of Rome in 161 CE, was a man born into unimaginable privilege. And yet his reign was anything but comfortable. Plague swept across the empire, Germanic tribes pushed at the borders. His co-emperor Lucius Verus died early. His generals betrayed him. And worst of all, his own son, Commodus, would grow into the tyrant he had hoped never to raise. Amid all this, Marcus didn't write speeches or propaganda. He wrote to himself quiet, personal reflections later compiled into the Meditations. Never intended for publication, these pages offer a window into a Stoic mind under siege. They read not like declarations from a throne, but like whispered reminders from a tired man trying to stay upright. "Begin each day by telling yourself," he wrote, "Today I shall meet with interference and ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness." That wasn't pessimism. It was preparation. Marcus believed that by expecting hardship, he could face it without being thrown off course. To him, people's actions were not insults. They were reflections of their ignorance. And his duty wasn't to control others, but to control himself. He often reminded himself, "You could die tomorrow. You could die today, so act now, not with anxiety, but with purpose." That wasn't despair. That was clarity. Despite commanding legions and managing a vast empire, Marcus was obsessed with inner life. He believed you could be surrounded by chaos and still remain untouched if your mind stayed anchored in reason and virtue. He rarely indulged in cruelty. He rejected opulence, and while he couldn't always live up to Stoic ideals, who could? He returned to them like a compass in a storm. Marcus Aurelius didn't invent Stoicism, but in many ways he lived it more visibly than anyone before him. He proved that Stoicism wasn't just for philosophers in togas or ascetic monks. It was for anyone, even the most powerful man on earth, who wanted to carry peace into the battlefield of life. And yet, after Marcus, the flame of Stoicism began to flicker. It wouldn't vanish, but it would retreat, waiting centuries to be rediscovered by new seekers of calm in the modern world. After the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, Stoicism didn't exactly die, but it faded. The philosophy that had once stood at the heart of Roman intellectual life began to slip quietly into the background. Part of this had to do with politics. Marcus's son, Commodus, inherited the empire and seemed determined to undo every stoic virtue his father lived by. While Marcus embodied restraint and wisdom, Commodus embodied indulgence and vanity. The Roman court became a theater of excess, and philosophy had no role in the spectacle. Meanwhile, a new force was rising: Christianity. As it spread through the Roman Empire and eventually became state religion, its theology, rituals, and worldview began to replace the ancient schools. Where Stoicism taught self-reliance, Christianity emphasized divine grace. Where Stoicism taught acceptance of fate, Christianity spoke of redemption and the will of God. Though these ideas weren't always in conflict, Christian thinkers often saw Stoicism as a noble but ultimately pagan system, admirable yet incomplete. And yet, Stoicism didn't vanish. It simply migrated. Its core ideas seeped into early Christian thought. Many church fathers admired the Stoics. Thinkers like Augustine, though critical of Stoic pride, respected their moral seriousness. And monastic traditions, especially among Christian ascetics, borrowed heavily from Stoic discipline. Silence, simplicity, denial of luxury, and the examination of conscience. All of these would have felt right at home in the writings of Epictetus or Seneca. Throughout the medieval period, Stoicism became a sort of background philosophy, respected by scholars, cited by monks, but rarely practiced in full. It was no longer a public movement or a street-side school. It was a whisper in the margins, kept alive by scribes, theologians, and the occasional curious mind. But survival is sometimes stronger than success. Stoicism's quiet endurance meant that when the intellectual wind shifted centuries later, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, its ideas would be ready to return. For all its decline, Stoicism had left seeds buried in the soil of Western thought, and when people once again sought clarity, purpose, and strength without illusion, those seeds would bloom. And one day they'd even show up in places no ancient philosopher could have imagined in self-help books. Leadership, seminars, and yes, on your favorite podcast. Stoicism's comeback didn't arrive with a scroll in hand. It came through blogs, books, and podcasts. After centuries of quiet influence, the ancient philosophy found itself suddenly reborn in the digital age, repackaged for a world buzzing with distractions, anxieties, and the pressure to constantly optimize everything in the 20th century. Philosophers like Pierre Hadot began peeling back the layers of Stoicism, reminding readers that it wasn't just an intellectual exercise, it was a way of life. Not cold, but contemplative, not harsh, but healing. Hadot argued that ancient philosophy was originally a spiritual practice, and Stoicism, more than any other school, was meant to be lived, not merely read. That message hit home for a new generation. In the early 2000s, authors like Ryan Holiday helped usher Stoicism into the mainstream with accessible books like The Obstacle is the Way and Ego is the Enemy. Drawing on Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, Holiday framed Stoicism as a practical toolkit for resilience, something you could use whether you were launching a startup, coaching a sports team, or just trying to survive a bad Monday. Tech leaders and entrepreneurs soon latched on Tim Ferriss. Naval Ravikant and others began citing Stoic texts like instruction manuals for high-performance living. The idea was simple. In a world that moves fast, thinks shallow, and craves constant validation, Stoicism offers an antidote. Stillness, control, and clarity. Even mental health professionals took notice. Therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, borrow heavily from Stoic principles. Challenge your thoughts. Focus on what you can control. Don't let emotion dictate action. Sound familiar? But the revival wasn't without criticism. Some said modern Stoicism had been stripped of its depth, turned into motivational wallpaper for productivity for others. And there's truth to that. Not every inspirational quote on Instagram reflects the rigor or humility of ancient practice. Still, the fact remains that Stoicism survived. Not because it was trendy, but because it works. When life goes sideways, when we lose a job, face a diagnosis, or wake up unsure of our place in the world, Stoicism reminds us you can't control what happens, but you can control what you become. That message has never been more timely, and so we arrive at the present, where ancient wisdom quietly guides modern minds. Today, Stoicism exists in a paradox. It is an ancient philosophy designed for inner peace, now living in a world obsessed with noise. Scroll through social media, and you'll see a quote from Marcus Aurelius sandwiched between cat videos and stock tips. Open a bestseller list, and there it is again, the daily Stoic waiting to be your morning mental vitamin. Somehow a 2,300-year-old porch philosophy is trending, but Stoicism isn't popular. Because it's fashionable. It's popular because it addresses a very specific modern hunger, mental clarity in a world of confusion. When everything feels out of control, the economy, relationships, climate, algorithms, Stoicism offers a map inward. It teaches us to focus not on the chaos around us, but on the choices we still own. The central questions remain the same. What is in your control? What kind of person will you choose to be, regardless of circumstance? And unlike some philosophies that demand total withdrawal from the world, Stoicism invites us to participate. Go to work, raise your kids, serve a community, but do it from a place of calm, not craving. Action, yes, but grounded action. In that sense, Stoicism is a kind of rebellion, not the loud, sign-waving kind, but a silent resistance against impulsiveness, distraction, and emotional chaos. It's the discipline to pause before reacting, the courage to stay kind in a cruel moment, the humility to know you're not the center of the universe, but you are responsible for how you move through it. More than ever, people are returning to this simple clarity. Athletes use it to manage pressure. Veterans use it to process trauma. CEOs use it to lead without ego. Teenagers, overwhelmed by the constant flood of comparison and digital noise, turn to Epictetus for a lifeline. Of course, no philosophy is a magic here. You'll still feel grief, still fail, still lose your temper. But Stoicism gives you something rare, a framework to get back up, reflect, and recenter in the end. It's not about being perfect. It's about progress. Quiet, steady, internal progress. And in a world that rewards loudness, maybe the most revolutionary act is to be still. To a modern visitor, an ancient Roman bath might look like a luxury resort. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, statues of gods, and pools steaming in a morning sun. But to a Roman, it was just another Tuesday. Bathing wasn't an occasional treat. It was a daily ritual, and for many, an essential part of being Roman. By the height of the empire, there were over 900 public baths in Rome alone, ranging from grand imperial complexes to modest neighborhood facilities. Everyone from senators to shoemakers made time to bathe. Cleanliness was important, yes, but so was the rhythm of the experience, the routine, the conversation, the heat. The process was deliberate. You'd enter through the apodyterium or changing room, where slaves might help wealthier patrons undress. From there, you'd ease into the tepidarium, a warm room that opened your paws and began a relaxation. Then came the caldarium, the hearth experience, a hot, steamy chamber heated by an underfloor system called the hypocaustere. Bathers would sweat, scrape their skin with strigils, curved metal tools, and sometimes even get a massage. Finally, you'd plunge into the frigidarium, a cold pool meant to tighten the skin and jolt the senses. It was this contrast, hot to cold, sweat to chill, that gave the ritual its power. Romans believed it was good for circulation, digestion, and even mood. And honestly, they were probably right, but more than hygiene or health. Baths were about belonging. You want to see and be seen. You gossiped, networked, debated politics, made business deals, or just eavesdropped on the latest scandal. Some brought their own musicians. Others brought snacks. Poets recited verses. Philosophers argued under domed ceilings, echoing with laughter and steam. In essence, a Roman bath was a democratic space, at least by Roman standards. Status mattered, but even emperors might share a room with commoners. Slaves and women had restricted access or separate hours, but they too were part of this daily world. For the Romans, bathing wasn't about vanity. It was about routine, health, society, and rhythm. A place where the individual dissolved just a bit into the larger hum of the empire, one breath of steam at a time. Roman baths weren't just impressive, they were engineering masterpieces. Long before the modern sauna or heated flooring, the Romans figured out how to transform bricks, fire and water into an immersive wellness center. At the core of this innovation was the hypocaust system, an early form of central heating. Beneath the floors of the hot rooms, slaves stoked a roaring furnace or progenium. This fire heated a space beneath the raised floor. Supported by small columns called pillae, hot air flowed through this subfloor chamber and up through flues in the walls, radiating heat through the room like a gentle oven. The result? A consistent enveloping warmth without smoke suffocating the bathers. The architecture itself was strategic. Vaulted ceilings trapped heat, domes diffused sound, and a complex arrangement of rooms regulated temperature flow. From the cooler apodyterium to the temperate tepidarium to the blazing caldarium. Windows were designed to harness sunlight, and water was constantly circulating, clean, flowing, and heated to exacting standards. And let's talk about the aqueducts, the silent heroes of the empire. These elevated stone channels delivered vast quantities of water into the cities, allowing even inland bath complexes to operate year-round. Some of the grandest baths, like those of Caracalla or Diocletian, consumed millions of liters of water daily. Yet the system was so well built that waste was minimal and flow was constant. The water wasn't just used for soaking. Romans also had steam rooms, saunas, and even primitive flushing toilets nearby. Sewage was carried away through underground drainage systems. Again, all gravity-powered. The baths weren't isolated marvels. They were integrated into the broader infrastructure of Roman urban life. Maintenance was constant. Workers known as fornicators tended the furnaces while others cleaned the pools, managed supplies of wood, or repaired tiles and plumbing. It was labor-intensive, but the reward was clear. These buildings didn't just last years. Many stood strong for centuries in an age with no electricity, no industrial machinery, and no digital thermostats. The Romans created a seamless experience of heat, comfort, and flow. That's why walking into a Roman bath wasn't just entering a building. It was entering a system, one powered by fire, sustained by water, and shaped by genius. Despite all the sweat, steam, and strigils, Roman baths were never just about physical cleansing. They were about information. In a society without smartphones, email, or newspapers, the baths functioned as a kind of open-air broadcast center. Gossip didn't trickle here. It flowed. Senators, merchants, soldiers, and poets all mingled freely, with togas off and voices raised. Conversations carried across the tepidarium like wildfire. Who was sleeping with whom? What was the emperor plotting? Which general just lost a battle in the east? Who bribed which magistrate to get out of paying taxes? If you wanted to know what was happening in Rome, or what might happen soon, the bathhouse was the place to listen. This wasn't accidental. The Roman elite knew the baths were public arenas, and they used them strategically. Politics didn't stop at the Senate steps. They soaked right into the marble floors of the caldarium. A clever patrician might accidentally bump into a rival in the hot room and float a proposal under the haze of steam. Or perhaps a patron would meet a client to reaffirm loyalties, offer advice, or drop a veiled threat, all while lounging in the pool. Even emperors played the game. It's said that Hadrian and later Antoninus Pius made a point of visiting the public baths as an act of image control, appearing accessible, wise, and invested in the lives of ordinary citizens. Of course, they had private bath wings too, but showing up in the public zone was a statement. I'm still one of you, sort of. It wasn't just politics that steamed up the tiles. Businessmen negotiated deals. Poets recited lines. Philosophers debated ethics. The acoustics of the domed rooms often helped amplify voices, a useful trick for anyone who wanted their cleverness overheard. In a strange way, the bathhouse was Rome's version of Twitter, Wall Street, and the Senate floor all at once. It was unfiltered, buzzing, and deeply performative. But it was also where strategy was born. Real decisions, military, financial, personal, often started here, far from the formal halls of power, because when everyone is half naked, sweating and relaxed, masks fall away and in the steam. The real empire whispered its plans. To the Romans, bathing wasn't just about feeling fresh or looking polished. It was a critical part of health and medicine. The bathhouse was where ancient wellness philosophy met practical self-care. Doctors recommended it. Philosophers endorsed it. Even the military encouraged it. Hot water, cold plunges, sweating, and massages were all believed to purify the body and balance the humors. The four fluids the Romans thought governed health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these got out of balance, you got sick. But a visit to the baths, with its cycle of heating, scraping, and cooling, could supposedly restore that balance. And there's some logic to it, even by modern standards. The heat of the caldarium opened pores, relaxed muscles, and helped with circulation. The cold plunge in the frigidarium reduced inflammation and invigorated the senses. The skin was scraped clean with strigils, which removed dirt, oil, and dead skin. Afterward, many Romans received massages using scented oils, sometimes infused with herbs, sometimes just olive oil. Today we might call this detoxing or hydrotherapy. They just called it daily life. Some of the larger bath complexes even included small medical clinics where physicians, often Greek-educated, examined patients, offered treatments or suggested dietary changes. If you had a cough, aching joints, or digestive troubles, your doctor might prescribe not a pill, but a visit to the tepidarium or a change in your bathing routine. Exercise was part of the picture, too. Many baths had attached palaster, open courtyards for physical activity. Romans boxed, wrestled, fenced, or played ball games before beginning the bathing process. The idea was to work up a sweat before entering the steam rooms. Health wasn't passive. It earned one push-up and plunge at a time. Even mental health wasn't ignored. The rhythm of the bath. Its slow, deliberate transitions from room to room encouraged reflection. Some Stoics and Epicureans even wrote about the baths as places to clear the mind and tame the emotions. In many ways, Roman baths were ahead of their time, an integrated space for exercise, cleansing, socializing, and healing, a kind of ancient wellness center with better mosaics and slightly more gossip. For the Romans, a healthy body wasn't a goal. It was the foundation of virtue, clarity, and strength. And the bathhouse was where it all began. Walking into a grand Roman bathhouse wasn't just stepping into a building, it was stepping into an aesthetic experience. The architecture, the materials, the very air. Everything was designed to impress, soothe, and elevate. From the moment you entered the apoditerium changing room, you were surrounded by elegance. The walls were often painted in vivid frescoes, mythological scenes, pastoral landscapes, or even cheeky caricatures. Marble benches lined a room, niches held clothing, and on the better days, musicians played softly in the background while your sandals were taken by a servant. Then came the baths themselves. The tepidarium was usually the most beautiful room, designed as a kind of warm antechamber to the hotter and colder extremes. It was often circular or rectangular, with high vaulted ceilings, colorful mosaics on the floors, and large windows that diffused the afternoon light. The ceilings were sometimes coffered or domed, supported by columns of Egyptian granite or local stone. The caldarium, the hot room, featured heated pools and steam. You'd see bronze or terracotta braziers, and sometimes gilded taps that flowed with heated water. The floors were warm beneath your feet. Thanks to the Hippocrates system, and the air shimmered with heat, decorative fountains and statues added a touch of divine elegance. Apollo, Venus, and Hercules all made appearances. The frigidarium, cool and serene, was usually the largest and most striking space. Its cold pool reflected a ceiling, often covered in painted stars or geometric patterns. The water itself glistened, sometimes lit by small skylights or open oculi that allowed a beam of sunlight to cut through the mist. There was a quiet stillness here, a contrast to the chatter and bustle of the earlier rooms. Everything in a Roman bath was designed to inspire awe. The use of imported marble, colorful tile work, and advanced geometry wasn't just vanity, it was a statement. The baths were the empire distilled into stone, orderly, refined and proudly extravagant. Even smaller local baths took design seriously. Mosaics often warned bathers with humorous Latin phrases like cave canum, beware the dog, or balneum gratum. The bath is pleasant. These were spaces meant to charm the eye, calm the spirit, and remind you, in case you forgot, that you were living in the greatest civilization on earth. And all of that, before you even got wet. While Roman baths were public spaces in theory, not all Romans experienced them equally. The bathhouse was a microcosm of Roman society. a place where lines blurred but never fully disappeared. Let's start with class. In the grand thermae of Rome, like those of Caracalla or Trajan, emperors might bathe in the same rooms as commoners. That sounds democratic, but social distinctions still lingered. The wealthy often arrived with entourages, slaves to carry towels, oils, and even portable benches. They could afford private massages or extra services in nearby rooms. Some larger baths had exclusive sections, scholars reserved for upper-class patrons. Even in the shared pools, there was an unspoken hierarchy. You might rub elbows with a senator, but you weren't about to chat him up. Then there was gender. Men and women did not usually bathe together. Most large bathhouses offered separate hours or separate wings. Some emperors, like Hadrian, enforced strict segregation. Others, like Commodus or Elagabalus, allowed or even encouraged mixed bathing, much to the horror of conservative Roman moralists. Women's access depended on time, location, and the whims of local officials in wealthier cities. Women had beautifully appointed baths of their own. In poorer regions, they often bathed early in the day, before men arrived. While some women enjoyed regular access, others, particularly those of lower status, had to navigate schedules, scrutiny, and social stigma. Slaves and freedmen made up a significant portion of bath visitors. They were allowed in and often encouraged to attend, especially if their work was labor-intensive. However, they typically entered during off hours or in more modest facilities. That said, many slaves worked within the bathhouses as attendants, masseurs, or fire stokers, and some were known by name for their skill and charm. And what about outsiders? Foreigners, non-citizens, and provincials were welcomed in most Roman cities, especially in the empire's heyday. In fact, the spread of Roman baths across conquered territories. It was one of the empire's tools of cultural integration, a way of saying welcome to Rome. Now take your clothes off. So yes, the Roman baths were a shared space, but just like in the forums or the Senate, your experience depended heavily on who you were. Still, for a brief moment in the mist, the hot stone and the splash of cold water, those lines could blur, and that was part of the magic, though bathing was the central activity. Roman bathhouses were far more than places to get clean. They were entertainment hubs, part gym, part theater, part lounge, where you could easily spend an entire afternoon. And many did. In fact, larger bath complexes resembled ancient leisure centers. After a workout in the palestra, a courtyard used for wrestling, boxing, or ball games, you might take a stroll to the library located just off the main hallway. Yes, many baths had libraries. Romans could relax with scrolls by Cicero or Virgil, blending physical rejuvenation with intellectual stimulation. A healthy body and a healthy mind. Both were on the menu. Music filled the air too. It wasn't uncommon to hear live performances from flutists, harpists, or singers echoing through the domed chambers. Bathers might be serenaded while reclining near a fountain or getting an oil rub down. In fact, some bathhouses employed professional entertainers to keep the mood light and luxurious, from acrobats to comedians. There were also food stalls and snack counters, often located in or near the apoditerium. Known as papini, these small eateries served wine, bread, olives, cheese, and dried fruits for wealthier patrons. Personal slaves could bring more elaborate dishes and the occasional exotic treat from nearby villas. So yes, you could technically eat grapes in the steam room like a decadent emperor, though etiquette varied. Gambling was common too. Dice games, betting on athletic matches, or just casual wagers among friends added an air of mischief to the setting. These activities weren't always legal, but they were tolerated in bath culture. After all, people came here to let loose. The bathhouses also had spaces for intimate encounters. Some rooms functioned as private lounges or even brothels, depending on the time and location. Morally ambiguous, definitely. But Roman society had a much different view of public space, privacy, and sensuality than we do today, and the steamy, dimly lit atmosphere of the Caldarium only added to the allure. One of Rome's most remarkable achievements wasn't just building an empire. It was standardizing the Roman experience across thousands of miles, and that included baths. From the misty highlands of Britannia to the deserts of North Africa, and from the forests of Gaul to the sands of Syria, The Roman bath became a unifying symbol of Roman identity. Wherever the legions marched and the engineers followed, they built roads, forts, and bathhouses. These provincial baths weren't just carbon copies. They reflected local resources and customs while still following the essential Roman layout of podaterium, tepidarium, caldarium, frigidarium. In cold climates like Britain or Germania, the hot rooms were especially important. In warmer places like North Africa or the Levant, some bathhouses expanded to shaded colonnades and cool pools, offering relief from the blistering sun. Cities like Timgad in Algeria, Jerash in Jordan, and Bath in England all featured impressive thermae, often with mosaics, sculptures, and inscriptions celebrating imperial generosity. These weren't just public works, they were propaganda in stone. Every polished marble slab and steaming pool reminded locals this is Rome, and Rome takes care of its people. But baths also played a critical role in cultural integration. For newly conquered peoples, the bathhouse served as a soft introduction to Roman customs. You might still speak your own language at home, but once you stripped off your clothes and stepped into the steam, you were participating in a Roman ritual, one that transcended ethnicity, origin, or local tribe. It also became a mark of urbanization. A city wasn't truly Roman until it had proper baths. They often came bundled with forums, amphitheaters, and temples, creating civic centers that mirrored those of the capital. Bathing, then, wasn't just about hygiene, it was about civilization. Of course, local twists were made. In Syria, baths sometimes incorporated Eastern architectural styles and mixed gender spaces. In Britain, Celtic traditions subtly influenced the bathing sequence. And in Egypt, older Hellenistic models blended with Roman designs to create hybrid complexes with lush courtyards and incense-filled chambers. No matter the local flavor, the Roman bath became a universal experience, one that made an empire feel cohesive. A place where, even at the farthest frontier, you could close your eyes in a caldarium and, for a moment, feel like you were in the heart of Rome. Like so much of Roman civilization, the glory of the baths didn't last forever. As the empire weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, so too did the great bathhouses. What had once been daily rituals for millions slowly slipped into disrepair, abandonment, and eventually ruin. Several factors contributed to this decline. First, the empire's economy crumbled under the weight of inflation, military overreach, and political instability, funding the maintenance of vast bath complexes, which required teams of workers. Constant fuel for the hippocaust and clean water from aqueducts became unsustainable. Then came the breakdown of infrastructure. Aqueducts fell into neglect or were deliberately destroyed during invasions. Without running water, the baths lost their core purpose. The once bubbling caldariums went dry, and the marble halls echoed with silence. Religion also played a part. As Christianity became dominant, public bathing, especially mixed or nude bathing, came under increasing moral scrutiny. Church leaders saw the baths as symbols of pagan indulgence and bodily vanity. While some Christian emperors tried to preserve the public health function of the baths, others shut them down or repurposed them into churches, monasteries, or administrative buildings. And yet the legacy of Roman baths endured. In the Islamic world, the tradition continued through hammams, bathhouses that carried forward many Roman innovations, heated rooms, steam treatments, and communal cleansing rituals. These spread across the Middle East and North Africa, preserving the essence of Roman wellness in a new religious and cultural framework. In Europe, spas and mineral baths became popular during the Renaissance and later Enlightenment, especially in places like Bath, England, and Baden-Baden, Germany. These revived bathing as a therapeutic and social activity, echoing the Roman model, even as the empire itself was long gone. Today, the ruins of Roman baths still captivate visitors. The baths of Caracalla, the Stabian baths in Pompeii, and countless smaller sites across Europe and the Mediterranean remind us that Rome didn't just conquer through the sword, it conquered through comfort, engineering, and shared ritual. Roman baths may have crumbled, but their spirit lives on in our gyms, our spas, our hot showers, and our quiet moments of self-care. In a way, every time we draw a hot bath or sit in a sauna, we're channeling a bit of the empire. Steam rising, tension fading, time slowing, just as it did 2,000 years ago. In ancient Egypt, medicine didn't live in a laboratory. It lived in the temple, the home, and the world of the gods. Healing was not just a science, it was a spiritual art, and the person who treated your illness might just recite a spell while applying a poultice to your wound. That's because Egyptian medicine was deeply intertwined with religion. Illness to them wasn't only about injury or infection. It could also be caused by the wrath of a god, the invasion of a malevolent spirit, or a disruption in Maya, the cosmic order that governed all things. So doctors, known as SWNU, weren't always working alone. They often collaborated with priests who specialized in ritual and incantation. Together, they formed a dual force of treatment, one applying remedies, the other invoking divine protection. Temples were more than places of worship. They were centers of healing. Specific temples, like those dedicated to Imhotep, the architect, physician, and later deified healer, served as proto-hospitals. People would sleep there in hopes of divine dreams that revealed the source of their ailment or the cure itself. This was called incubation, and it was a respected method of diagnosis. Medical training was rigorous. Physicians studied scrolls like the Ebers Papyrus and Edwin Smith Papyrus, which outlined hundreds of remedies, procedures, and case studies. These documents show that while the Egyptians invoked gods, they also observed symptoms, recorded outcomes, and developed surprisingly advanced techniques, from wound suturing to dental care. But make no mistake, incantations were not just decorative. Many prescriptions included spells as ingredients. A broken bone might be treated with honey and linen, plus a recitation to ward off evil spirits. Psychological conditions, now recognized as mental illness, were seen as spiritual afflictions, often requiring the intervention of a priest or magician. To us, this fusion of medicine and mysticism might seem contradictory, but to the Egyptians it was holistic. Body, mind, and spirit were part of the same continuum. Healing one meant addressing all. In the land of the Nile, to be a healer was to walk between two worlds, with one hand mixing herbs and the other raised toward the gods. Long before stethoscopes and lab tests, ancient Egyptian physicians relied on their senses and experience. They became masters of visual diagnosis, feeling pulses, examining wounds, and interpreting subtle signs in the body to understand what was wrong. Even if they believed the root cause might be spiritual, the first step in diagnosis was always observation. Physicians would examine a patient's posture, skin color, breath, and even urine or feces to search for visible or olfactory clues. Was the swelling soft or hard? Did the discharge smell sweet or foul? These observations weren't just guesswork. They were documented, compared, and passed down through generations. The pulse held particular significance. The Egyptians called it the speech of the heart. They believed that the heart was the center of a system of channels similar to a network of irrigation canals through which air, blood, and spirit flowed. If the pulse was irregular or weak, it suggested that one of these vital channels was blocked or disturbed, although their anatomical understanding wasn't perfect. Their conclusions often reflected real symptoms and led to logical treatments. Yet when no physical explanation was found, the physician would turn to spiritual causes. Was the illness a punishment from God, a curse from an enemy, a lingering spirit refusing to leave the body? In such cases, diagnosis involved more than examination. It required consultation with a priest-magician and dream interpretation, or even astrological analysis. The alignment of stars and the behavior of sacred animals might factor into the final verdict. In texts like the Ebers Papyrus, physicians categorized diseases based on patterns. They didn't always know why something happened, but they knew what usually followed. For instance, they could identify the stages of an infected wound or the course of a fever. These practical patterns formed the basis for treatment protocols, and interestingly, they were not always superstitious. Some medical texts explicitly separate physical ailments from spiritual ones. If a wound could be seen, smelled, and treated, no spell required. But if all else failed, it was time to invoke divine aid too. In ancient Egypt, the world was filled with unseen forces. But through keen eyes, careful hands, and centuries of accumulated wisdom, their physicians sought to make the invisible visible. When it came to treatment, ancient Egyptian physicians had an astonishing arsenal of remedies and recipes. Their pharmacies weren't stocked with pills and injections, but with herbs, minerals, animal products, and oils, many of which they combine with surgical procedures and ritual chants. The result? A holistic approach that blended natural science with spiritual symbolism. At the heart of their medicine was the Ebers Papyrus, a 110-page scroll from around 1550 BCE. It contains over 700 prescriptions addressing everything from stomach pain and toothaches to skin diseases and fertility issues. Each recipe was tailored not just to the disease, but to the patient's body and social status, and often included precise instructions for mixing, timing, and application. One of their favorite ingredients? Honey, prized for its antimicrobial properties and still used today in wound care. Honey was applied to cuts, burns, and ulcers, often mixed with other substances like crushed seeds or resin. They also used garlic, onion, juniper berries, and myrrh, not just for their aroma, but for their antiseptic and anti-inflammatory effects. Their pharmacopoeia included more exotic fare as well. Crocodile dung for contraceptives, lizard blood for skin treatments, hippopotamus fat, and even mummified human flesh for particularly superstitious cures. To modernize, this may seem grotesque, but these remedies reflected their belief that the power of the ingredient lay not only in its physical properties, but also in its spiritual essence. Minerals like natron, a naturally occurring salt, were used to dry wounds, cleanse infections, and preserve bodies. Copper, known for its antimicrobial qualities, was sometimes crushed and mixed into salves. Oils from lotus, castor beans, and black cumin were used for massage and pain relief. Doses varied depending on the affliction. A prescription might read mixed crushed sycamore fruit. Honey and natron apply for 4 days. Recite the following spell over the mixture. In Egypt, words were medicine too. The spoken charm activated the cure, a reminder that for them, healing was as much about meaning as it was about chemistry. Far from primitive guesswork, Egyptian medicine was highly systematic, documented, and refined. While some remedies were bizarre, many were surprisingly effective, and some survived. In spirit or science, even today, their medicine chest was drawn from the land, the body, and the gods, and they reached into all three to heal. While much of ancient Egyptian medicine focused on herbs and incantations, the Egyptians were not afraid to cut when necessary. They understood that some ailments needed more than a poultice or a prayer. They needed a steady hand and a sharp blade. The best evidence of Egyptian surgery comes from the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a 3,600-year-old medical text unlike any other from the ancient world. It is methodical, clinical, and strikingly modern in tone. It describes 48 cases, mostly traumatic injuries, skull fractures, broken collarbones, spinal wounds, and includes step-by-step instructions on examination, treatment, and prognosis. What's fascinating is how pragmatic the document is. It even classifies cases into 3 outcomes: an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, and an ailment not to be treated. In other words, treatable, uncertain, and hopeless. This was triage, a concept we still use in emergency medicine today. Egyptian surgeons used a range of tools: bronze knives, scalpels, forceps, cautery hooks, and needles. They practiced stitching wounds, draining abscesses, setting bones with wooden splints, and even performing circumcisions. Some mummies show evidence of successful bone healing, indicating that patients survived their injuries and continued living for years. They were also pioneers in wound hygiene. Before stitching a cut, a physician might cleanse it with honey, beer, or resin, all of which have antiseptic properties. They then applied bandages soaked in oils or herbal mixtures to reduce inflammation and promote healing. Pain was eased with opium extracts or sedative herbs, though there's no evidence of general anesthesia. Surgery was likely painful, but quick and precise. One striking detail: Egyptians often left foreign bodies like embedded arrowheads in place if removing them posed greater risk. It shows a nuanced understanding of anatomy and risk management. They knew when not to intervene. Of course, surgery had its limits. There's no record of internal operations or major amputations. They lack knowledge of circulation and infection the way we know it today. But within the boundaries of what was possible, Egyptian surgeons were remarkably skilled. They didn't just experiment. They observed, recorded, and passed their knowledge down through bandages and blades. Egypt laid the groundwork for practical hands-on medicine, and centuries later, those lessons would echo through the halls of Greek, Roman, and modern surgical practice. In ancient Egypt, women's health was not a fringe concern. It was central to medical practice. Fertility, pregnancy, childbirth, and contraception were all treated with serious attention, and women both received and sometimes practiced medical care themselves. One of the most fascinating sources on the topic is the Kahin Gynecological Papyrus, dating to around 1800 BCE. It's the oldest known medical text focused entirely on women's reproductive health. The document includes diagnoses and treatments for infertility, miscarriage, vaginal discharge, and birth complications. And like other Egyptian texts, each entry follows a familiar structure: the symptom, the examination, the diagnosis, and the treatment. Sometimes purely medical, sometimes magical, often both. For pregnancy, diagnosis began with clever experimentation. One common test involved having a woman urinate on barley and emma wheat seeds. If the barley sprouted, she was said to be carrying a boy. If emma grew, a girl. If neither sprouted, she was not pregnant. Believe it or not, modern tests suggest this method may have had a modest accuracy, likely due to hormone levels affecting germination. Contraceptives were another area of focus. Ancient physicians used mixtures like honey, acacia leaves, and ground dates, inserted as a kind of barrier. Some recipes included crocodile dung, which sounds alarming, but was likely used for its sticky texture and symbolic potency. These were primitive forms of spermicides and barriers aimed at preventing conception. During childbirth, midwives took the lead. They used birth bricks, the platforms on which the laboring woman squatted, and offered both physical and spiritual support. Incantations were spoken to ward off the Demonis Ammit, who was believed to cause miscarriages or birth complications. Protective amulets, especially those depicting Teret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, were worn to ensure a safe delivery. If labor was difficult, treatments ranged from massaging the womb with castor oil to having the mother breathe in herbal infusions or drink mixtures to stimulate the body's opening. Caesarean sections were unknown. If the birth could not be completed naturally, tragedy often still followed. Much of Egyptian obstetrics was remarkably advanced for its time. It reflected a culture where fertility was divine, womanhood sacred, and life itself a process watched over by both healer and God. In the cradle of civilization, they respected the cradle of life, with every chant, every herb, every whispered hope. To modern minds, the blend of magic and medicine might seem contradictory, but in ancient Egypt the two were inseparable. Healing the body meant treating the visible symptoms and the invisible forces, and sometimes the cure came as much from a spoken word as from a poultice. The Egyptians believed that illness could be caused by many things: natural imbalances, bad food, injury, but also curses, malevolent spirits, or the will of angry gods. If you broke your leg in an accident, that was one thing. But if your stomach hurts for days with no visible cause, that might be a demon or even the restless soul of the dead ox trying to torment you. In these cases, physicians turned to Heka, the sacred power of magic, which was thought to have been given to humanity by the gods themselves. Heka wasn't a stage illusion. It was a legitimate divine force, just as real as water or fire. A healer might use it to activate a remedy, protecting a wound from infection, or drive out an invisible entity. Spells were often included in medical texts, such as the Ebers Papyrus and the London Medical Papyrus. Some were poetic, others aggressive. One charm for treating burns reads, "O Isis, great magician, I call upon you to cool the fire in the flesh of your servant, as you cooled the fire that scorched your own son Horus." The spoken word was thought to imbue the remedy with divine power, turning herbs into miracles. Amulets were another form of protection and healing. People wore charms shaped like the eye of Horus, Banks, or the scarab beetle, each with symbolic significance. These amulets were believed to ward off evil, prevent disease, and protect both the living and the dead. Some were even embedded in bandages or placed directly on wounds. Specific deities were also invoked depending on the ailment. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plagues, was feared but also prayed for healing. Thoth, god of wisdom, was called upon to guide the hands of surgeons and scribes alike. In Egypt, medicine without magic was incomplete. The chant, the gesture, the symbol, all were part of the cure. Because for the ancient Egyptians, healing didn't just mean removing pain. It meant restoring harmony between the body, the soul, and the cosmos. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't the end of life. It was the beginning of eternity. And to reach the afterlife, the body had to be preserved with precision and care. Enter the art of mummification, a practice that blurred the lines between medicine, magic, and mortuary science. At its core, mummification was about preserving the physical vessel, so the soul could return to it in the afterlife. The body was seen as not just a shell, but a sacred structure that the car, vital spirit, and BA personality or soul needed to navigate the underworld and reunite in the next world. The process began shortly after death. Embalmers, who acted as both technicians and ritual specialists, washed the body with palm wine and Nile water. Then came the most critical step, removal of the internal organs, which were quick to decay. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver were extracted through an incision in the left side of the abdomen and placed in separate canopic jars, each guarded by one of the four sons of Horus. The brain, curiously, was considered unimportant and was removed through the nose using metal hooks. The heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, was often left in place, though in later periods it too was removed and replaced with a sacred amulet. The empty body cavity was then stuffed with resins, myrrh, and linen, and the entire body was covered in natron, a natural salt mixture, to dry it out. After 40 days, the body was washed again, anointed with oils and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, layer upon layer, often with protective amulets placed between folds. Each step was accompanied by spells, hymns, and rituals, particularly from the Book of the Dead. These invocations protected the deceased from demons and prepared them for judgment in the afterlife. The embalmer often wore a mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, to symbolize divine authority. In many ways, mummification was the Egyptians' most advanced medical procedure, a blend of anatomy, chemistry, and spiritual engineering. It wasn't about saving a life, it was about preserving it forever to them. The perfect body was more than a sign of health. It was a passport to eternity, and in every carefully wrapped limb they practiced medicine for the soul. While temples and tombs held the secrets of Egypt's gods, papyrus scrolls held the secrets of its doctors. Ancient Egyptian medicine was far from a series of oral traditions or tribal remedies. It was a well-documented, professionalized system, and much of what we know comes from the surviving medical texts, written with surprising structure and care. The most famous of these is the Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, though it likely copied even older knowledge. Over 100 feet long, it contains more than 700 remedies for illnesses, ranging from toothaches and stomach pains to mental disturbances and tumors. It includes detailed descriptions of symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments, often paired with spells or incantations. Another key text is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a practical surgical manual written with clinical precision. Unlike other papyri filled with magic and prayers, this one reads like the notes of a ward doctor. It presents case studies of traumatic injuries, mostly fractures, dislocations, and head wounds, and outlines step by step how to examine, treat, and prognosticate. It's a rare glimpse into how Egyptians could separate spiritual belief from empirical observation. The Kham Papyrus is another treasure focused specifically on women's health, fertility, and gynecology. It provides insight into birth control methods, pregnancy diagnosis, and even surgical procedures related to the uterus. These texts weren't hidden away. They were studied by scribes and physicians, many of whom trained at houses of life, scholarly institutions located within temples. Here, medicine was taught alongside mathematics, astronomy, and religious law. Medical apprentices would copy texts by hand, memorize spells, and observe more experienced doctors at work. The Egyptians believed in preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. Each scroll was a distillation of experience, observation, and divine insight, often attributed to gods like Thoth, the deity of wisdom and writing. Physicians didn't just treat bodies, they carried forward the knowledge of millennia. Interestingly, some Egyptian medical ideas made their way to Greece, especially through figures like Hippocrates and Galen, who studied Egyptian practices and praised their methods. Egypt's influence on classical medicine is undeniable in an age where much of the world relied on superstition alone. Egypt gave us one of the first examples of recorded, repeatable, and structured medical science, written in ink, bound in papyrus, and passed on with purpose. Though the sands of time bury their temples and tombs, the legacy of ancient Egyptian medicine never truly disappeared. In fact, many of their practices, beliefs, and innovations quietly shaped the course of global medical history. Their echoes still felt in today's hospitals, pharmacies, and spiritual healing traditions. First, their systematic approach to medicine was revolutionary. The Egyptians categorized symptoms, recorded treatments, and made careful observations about cause and effect. They developed early ideas about diagnosis, prognosis, and hygiene, centuries before the Greeks formalized such practices. Their emphasis on cleanliness, daily washing, antiseptic salves like honey and natron, even the importance of bowel regularity, prefigured modern public health long before the word existed. Their understanding of the mind-body connection was also ahead of its time. Though they didn't possess neuroscience, they recognized that psychological states could affect physical health. What they called spiritual affliction might today be recognized as depression, anxiety, or psychosomatic illness. And their combined treatments of herbs, rituals, and social support were surprisingly holistic. Even their use of herbal remedies has endured. Substances like garlic, castor oil, aloe vera, and willow bark, a precursor to aspirin, are still used today. Some refined into modern drugs, others sold in health food stores as supplements. And crocodile dung didn't make the cut. Their experimentation with contraception laid early groundwork for reproductive medicine. But perhaps most enduring is their idea of the healer as both technician and guide. In Egypt, a physician wasn't just someone who closed wounds, they were someone who understood suffering. Healing was physical, emotional, and spiritual. That human-centered model has re-emerged in modern holistic medicine, palliative care, and even psychotherapy. The fusion of medicine and magic might seem strange to us, but points to a truth that still holds. People don't just want to be cured, they want to be seen, comforted, and understood. Ancient Egyptian doctors knew this, and their scrolls, amulets, and incantations were not just treatments, they were acts of care. Their medicine wasn't perfect, but was daring, structured, curious, and deeply human.